At Styles Court, where shadows cling to faded walls, Hercule Poirot faces his final case. A killer hides among the guests, a master manipulator who murders without touching a weapon, who pulls the strings of death. Why has Poirot summoned Captain Hastings to this decaying estate? And what secret from their past threatens to unravel everything? A tense pause. A clock ticks. Time is running out, and the little grey cells must triumph or fall forever. Music crescendos fading to silence. Dive into curtain. Farewell, fatality, where every word hides a clue, and every heart hides a motive. Chapter 1. The Return to Styles. The train rattled through the English countryside, its rhythm a dull counterpoint to Captain Arthur Hastings' restless thoughts. The fields beyond the window, dappled with late summer gold, blurred into a haze of memory. Styles Court. The name alone summoned a cascade of images, crisp lawns, the sharp scent of roses, and the meticulous figure of Hercule Poirot, his moustache a banner of precision in a chaotic world. It had been decades since their first case together at this very estate, a case that had cemented their unlikely friendship. Now Poirot's urgent letter, penned in his unmistakable script, had summoned Hastings back. The words echoed in his mind, "Mon ami, I need you at Styles. Time is short, and the shadow is long." Hastings adjusted his hat, smoothing the brim as if to steady his nerves. The letter had been cryptic, its tone laced with a gravity he hadn't heard from Poirot in years. At 62, Hastings felt the weight of time himself. His joints ached. His hair had silvered, and his daughter Judith had grown into a woman whose fire both awed and baffled him. Yet Poirot's call was irresistible, a tether to a past where puzzles yielded to reason and justice prevailed. As the train slowed, the platform of Styles St. Mary came into view, a sleepy speck unchanged by the decades. Hastings disembarked, his suitcase heavy in his hand, and scanned the horizon. The village was quiet, save for the distant hum of a tractor and the chatter of sparrows. A battered taxi awaited. Its driver, a grizzled man with a pipe clenched between his teeth. "Styles Court, sir?" he asked, eyeing Hastings' city attire with mild curiosity. "Yes, please," Hastings replied, settling into the creaking seat. The drive was short, winding past hedgerows and a crumbling stone wall that marked the estate's boundary. As the taxi rounded a bend, Styles Court loomed into view, and Hastings' breath caught. The grand Georgian manor of his youth was a shadow of itself. Ivy clung to its weathered facade, windows stared blankly, and the once manicured lawn was overgrown with thistles. The air carried a faint mustiness, as if the house itself exhaled decay. The taxi halted, and Hastings stepped out, his shoes crunching on gravel. The driver tipped his cap. "Mind yourself, sir. Place ain't what it used to be." Hastings nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the house. The front door, painted a faded green, swung open, and a figure emerged, woman in her 50s, her hair streaked with grey, her apron dusted with flour. "Captain Hastings," she called, her voice warm but tinged with fatigue. "I'm Elizabeth Luttrell. Welcome to Styles." "Thank you, Mrs. Luttrell," Hastings said, offering a polite smile. "I'm here to see Monsieur Poirot." Her expression flickered, a mix of fondness and concern. "He's expecting you. Come in, please. Mind the step, it's loose." Inside, the house was a study in faded glory. The foyer's chandelier hung dark, its crystals dulled by dust. A staircase curved upward, its banister chipped. Mrs. Luttrell led him through a parlor where mismatched furniture sat under yellowed portraits. Voices drifted from a nearby room, low, murmured, then sharp with laughter. "The other guests," Mrs. Luttrell explained. "We've a full house this week. Tea's in the drawing-room, if you'd like to join after seeing your friend." Hastings followed her up the stairs, noting the creak of each step. She stopped at a door on the second floor and knocked softly. "Monsieur Poirot, your guest is here." And came a familiar voice, weaker than Hastings remembered, but still laced with that unmistakable cadence. Mrs. Luttrell opened the door and gestured for Hastings to enter. "I'll leave you to it," she said, retreating with a nod. The room was small, its curtains drawn against the afternoon light. Hercule Poirot sat in an armchair by a modest fireplace, a blanket draped over his knees. His face, once round and lively, was gaunt, his moustache still immaculate, but now stark against his pallor. Yet his eyes, those piercing green eyes, with undimmed intellect. "Mon ami Poirot," said, his voice soft but warm. "You have come. I feared you might not." Hastings set down his suitcase and crossed the room, grasping Poirot's outstretched hand. It was frail, the skin cool and papery. "Hercule, you old devil, you didn't give me much choice. That letter of yours positively melodramatic." Poirot's lips twitched into a smile. "Melodrama, Hastings. Non-precision. I wrote only what was necessary." He gestured to a chair. "Sit. We have much to discuss, and little time." Hastings settled into the chair, his gaze lingering on Poirot's diminished frame. "You're not well," he said quietly. Poirot waved a dismissive hand. "The body, it fails. But the little grey cells, they are as sharp as ever." His expression grew serious. "And they must be, for what lies ahead is no ordinary matter." Before Hastings could press further, a knock interrupted. The door opened to reveal a young woman, her auburn hair pulled into a loose bun, her eyes bright with a restless energy. "Father," she exclaimed, striding toward Hastings. "Judith." Hastings stood, enveloping his daughter in a hug. "What on earth are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," Judith said, pulling back with a grin. "I'm staying a few days. Research. You know botanical samples near the village. But I didn't expect to see you. Or Monsieur Poirot." She nodded to Poirot, her tone polite but reserved. Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle Judith, your presence adds a certain vivacity to Styles." Judith laughed, a sound both sharp. "Pound, you're too kind, monsieur. Though this place could use some life. It's practically a museum." Hastings frowned, sensing an undercurrent in her words. "You're not here alone, I hope." "Oh, no. Plenty of company. Judith said, her eyes flickering toward the door. "You'll meet them at tea. Quite the assortment." "An assortment?" "Oui," Poirot murmured, his gaze fixed on Judith. "And one must always study the pieces of a puzzle, no matter how charming they appear." Judith raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, excusing herself with a promise to see Hastings later. As the door closed, Hastings turned to Poirot. "She's changed. Grown up, I suppose. But you, Hercule, what's this about? Your letter mentioned danger." Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Danger, oui. A shadow moves among us, Hastings. A killer who does not kill with their own hands, but with the minds of others. A manipulator, a puppeteer. Here, at Styles, I sense their presence." Hastings stared, his mind racing. A murderer here. But who? The Luttrells, the guests. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "That, mon ami, is what we must discover. I have my suspicions, but proof is elusive. You must be my eyes, my ears. Observe, listen. The truth hides in the details." Before Hastings could respond, Mrs. Luttrell's voice called from below. "Tea's ready, gentlemen." Poirot gestured toward the door. "Go, Hastings. Meet the players in our little drama. But tread carefully. The shadow watches." The drawing-room was a cavernous space, its high ceilings stained with age, its windows letting in slants of dusty light. A long table held a silver tea service, mismatched cups, and a tray of scones. The guests were already gathered, their voices a low hum that stilled as Hastings entered. Mrs. Luttrell bustled over, pouring tea with practiced ease. "Captain Hastings, do join us. Let me introduce everyone." Colonel Luttrell, her husband, stood first, wiry man with a military bearing, his moustache bristling as he offered a firm handshake. "Retired, of course," he said, his voice gruff. "Run this place with Elizabeth. Keeps us busy." Next was Stephen Norton, a slight man with round glasses and a nervous habit of fidgeting with his tie. "Ornithologist," he mumbled, barely, meeting Hastings' eyes. "Here for the local bird life. Fascinating, really." Judith sat beside a man introduced as Major Allerton, whose easy smile and tailored suit suggested a certain charm. "Delighted to meet you," Captain Allerton said, his voice smooth. "Judith's been singing your praises." Judith rolled her eyes. "Hardly. I said you were punctual." Laughter rippled, broken by the arrival of Miss Cole, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and a reserved air. "Eleanor Cole," she said, her handshake brisk. "I'm here for quiet." Styles seemed as good a place as any. Dr. John Franklin, a lanky man with distracted eyes, nodded absently. "Research," he muttered. "Chemistry. The labs in London are too noisy." Beside him, his wife, Barbara, pale and delicate, offered a weak smile. "I hope the country air does me good," she said, her voice barely audible. Lastly, Nurse Craven, a sturdy woman with a nonsense demeanor, eyed Hastings appraisingly. "I look after Mrs. Franklin," she said, "and anyone else who needs it." Hastings took a seat, his mind cataloguing the faces. They seemed ordinary retirees, scholars, a nurse. Yet Poirot's warning gnawed at him. A killer among them. It seemed absurd. He sipped his tea, noting the faint bitterness of Leaves' conversation turned to the house's history. Styles has seen its share of drama, Colonel Luttrell said, leaning back. Back in the war, it was a hospital. Before that, well, murders, wasn't it? Hastings tensed, but Judith laughed. Murders. Really, Colonel, you make it sound like a Gothic novel. Oh, it's true, Mrs. Luttrell said, passing a plate of scones. Captain Hastings would know. You were here, weren't you, with that detective fellow? All eyes turned to Hastings. He cleared his throat. Yes, years ago. A case with Monsieur Poirot. All ancient history now. Not so ancient, Norton said, his voice soft. He held a newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. I found this in the library. Old case, 1916. Poison, wasn't it? Hastings' pulse quickened. You're well informed, Mr. Norton. Norton flushed, tucking the clipping away. Just a hobby. Crime stories, you know. Allerton leaned forward, his smile teasing. Careful, Norton. You'll have us thinking you're plotting something. The room laughed, but Hastings caught Poirot's absence keenly. He excused himself, promising to return, and made his way back to Poirot's room. The detective was waiting, a notebook open on his lap. Well, Poirot asked, his eyes sharp. There. Ordinary, Hastings said, hesitating. But Norton had a clipping about the old case. Seemed odd. Poirot nodded. Odd, The killer we seek thrives on such details. They weave their web slowly, Hastings. A word here, a suggestion there. By the time the trap closes, the victim does not see it. Hastings sank into the chair, unease settling in his chest. You really believe one of them is, what, a puppet master? Poirot's gaze was unwavering. I know it. And you, mon ami, must help me unmask them before it is too late. For now, observe, the shadow is here, and it kills without a trace. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the wall. Hastings felt a chill, not from the room, but from the weight of Poirot's words. Styles Court, once a place of triumph, was now a stage for a deadly game, and he, Hastings, was caught in its opening act. Chapter 2. The little grey cells stir the air at Styles Court, carried a damp chill, as though the house itself were exhaling memories of grander days. Captain Arthur Hastings stood at the window of the guest parlour, staring out at the overgrown gardens, their once manicured hedges now tangled and wild. The morning light was weak, filtered through a veil of grey clouds, and it did little to warm the unease that had settled in his chest since his arrival the previous evening. Poirot's cryptic warning from the night before echoed in his mind. We hunt a shadow, mon ami, but a shadow that kills. The words were as unsettling as the creak of the old house, and Hastings found himself turning them over, searching for meaning in their ambiguity. He glanced back at the room, its faded wallpaper and heavy oak furniture, a testament to Styles' decline. Poirot had retired to his room after breakfast, citing fatigue, though his sharp eyes betrayed no lack of focus. Hastings had been left to his own devices, tasked with observing the eclectic group of guests who now filled the once stately home. They were an odd assortment, each carrying an air of secrecy that made Poirot's suspicions feel less like paranoia and more like a grim inevitability. The parlor door swung open, and Judith Hastings entered, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, her expression a mix of curiosity and impatience. At 26, she was a striking contrast to her father. Where Hastings was cautious and measured, Judith was all fire and conviction, her green eyes alight with a restless energy. "Father, you've been staring out that window for ages," she said, her tone teasing but edged with concern. "What's got you so preoccupied? Surely not the weather." Hastings forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "Just taking in the view, my dear. Styles isn't what it used to be." Judith crossed the room, her boots clicking softly on the worn floorboards. She peered out the window, her brow furrowing. "It's a bit dreary, isn't it? But there's something compelling about it, like a puzzle waiting to be solved." Her words struck a chord, and Hastings studied her, wondering how much to share of Poirot's warning. Judith had always been perceptive, perhaps too much so, and he feared drawing her into whatever dangerous game Poirot was playing. "You're spending too much time with those university friends of yours," he said, lightly deflecting. "Always looking for mysteries where there are none." She laughed, a bright sound that cut through the room's gloom. "Oh, there's always a mystery, Father. You just have to know where to look." Before he could respond, the door opened again, admitting Colonel Luttrell, the gruff, silver-haired owner of Styles Court. His wife, Daisy, trailed behind her, nervous energy a stark contrast to his stern demeanor. "Morning, Hastings," Luttrell said, his voice clipped. "Miss Judith, hope you slept well. This old place can be a bit unsettling at night." "It's charming in its own way," Judith replied diplomatically, though her eyes flicked to Hastings, as if gauging his reaction. Daisy Luttrell fidgeted with the lace collar of her dress, her smile strained. "Oh, it's just the wind. You know, makes the windows rattle something awful. But we do our best to keep things cozy." Hastings nodded politely, but his attention was drawn to the doorway, where another guest entered. Stephen Norton, the ornithologist, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually distracted air. He carried a small notebook, his fingers stained with ink, and muttered to himself as he shuffled toward an armchair by the fireplace. "Morning, Norton," Luttrell said, his tone less than warm. "Still chasing those birds of yours?" Norton blinked, as if startled to be addressed. "Oh, yes, Colonel. The grounds here are quite promising. Saw a pair of goldfinches this morning. Remarkable creatures." His voice was soft, almost lost in the crackle of the fire, but there was a peculiar intensity in his gaze that made Hastings uneasy. Judith, ever curious, leaned forward. "Goldfinches. Do tell, Mr. Norton, what makes them so remarkable?" Norton's face lit up, and he launched into a detailed explanation of the bird's migratory patterns, his hands gesturing animatedly. Hastings listened with half an ear, his mind still on Poirot's words. Norton seemed harmless enough, but there was something off about him, a nervous energy that didn't quite match his scholarly demeanor. Was this the shadow Poirot spoke of, or was Hastings letting his imagination run wild? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Allerton, a man whose easy charm and tailored suit stood out sharply against the faded backdrop of Styles. He flashed a grin at Judith, who returned it with a raised eyebrow. "Good morning, all," Allerton said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "I trust we're all surviving the rigors of country life." "Barely," Judith quipped, her tone playful but guarded, "though I suspect you're more at home in London drawing-rooms." Major Allerton laughed, undeterred. "You wound me, Miss Hastings. I'll have you know I'm quite adept at rusticating, though I confess the company here is far more intriguing than the scenery." Hastings bristled at the flirtation, but Judith seemed unfazed, her smile cool and appraising. He made a mental note to keep an eye on Allerton. The man's charm was disarming, but Poirot had warned of a manipulator, and Allerton's effortless charisma fit the bill too well for comfort. The morning passed in a haze of small talk and strained pleasantries. Hastings found himself studying each guest, searching for the telltale signs Poirot had hinted at. The Luttrells bickered quietly over the state of the house, Daisy's nervous laughter punctuating her husband's gruff complaints. Norton retreated to his notebook, scribbling furiously, while Allerton hovered near Judith, his conversation light but persistent. By lunchtime, Hastings felt as though he were playing a game of chess with invisible pieces, every move fraught with unseen consequences. Poirot joined them for the midday meal, his wheelchair pushed by Nurse Craven, a sharp-eyed woman whose brisk efficiency bordered on coldness. The dining room was a cavernous space, its long table dwarfing the small gathering. Poirot, despite his frailty, commanded attention, his gaze sweeping the room like a searchlight. "Born Apipetty, Mies Amos," he said, his voice carrying a faint trace of irony. "It is a pleasure to dine in such stimulating company." The meal was a tense affair, the clink of cutlery and muted conversation filling the silence. Hastings noticed Judith's eyes lingering on Allerton, who was regaling her with a story about a misadventure in Cairo. Across the table, Norton fumbled, bore with his fork, his attention fixed on a folded newspaper at his elbow. Hastings leaned closer, catching a glimpse of the headline, "Unsolved Murder in Devon Shocks Village." The date was recent, and the article mentioned a young woman found dead under mysterious circumstances. Norton's interest in it seemed cut more than casual, and Hastings felt a chill. "Mr. Norton," he ventured, keeping his tone light, "you seem quite engrossed in that paper. Anything interesting?" Norton started, nearly dropping his fork. "Oh, just local news. Tragic, really. Such a young life cut short." "Indeed," Poirot interjected, his voice deceptively mild. "The world is full of tragedies, Nan, but some are more calculated than others. The table fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words hanging in the air. Daisy Luttrell coughed nervously, and Allerton raised an eyebrow, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Judith shot Hastings a questioning look, but he avoided her gaze, his mind racing. Was Norton's interest in the murder a clue, or merely a coincidence? And why had Poirot chosen that moment to stir the pot? After lunch, Poirot beckoned Hastings to his room, a small, sparsely furnished space that smelled faintly of lavender and liniment. The detective sat by the window, a blanket draped over his knees, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Despite his physical frailty, there was a fire in his eyes that Hastings hadn't seen in years. "You have observed, mon ami?" Poirot asked, his voice low but insistent. "You have seen the little details, the glances, the hesitations." Hastings hesitated, unsure how to articulate the jumble of impressions in his mind. "I've noticed tensions, Norton's fixation, bar on that newspaper, for one. And Allerton's interest in Judith is a bit too keen for my liking." Poirot nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Bon, you begin to see, but you must look deeper, Hastings. The killer we seek does not act with their own hands. They plant the seed, nurture it, and watch it grow. The crime is not in the act, but in the mind that orchestrates it." Hastings frowned, struggling to grasp Poirot's meaning. "You're saying one of them is, what? A puppet master, manipulating someone else into killing?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And they are here among us. 5 times they have succeeded, and none have suspected their hand. But I, Hercule Poirot, I will not be deceived." The weight of Poirot's certainty pressed down on Hastings, and he felt a surge of frustration. But who? Poirot, Norton, Allerton, one of the Luttrells. You speak in riddles, and I am no closer to understanding. Poirot's expression softened, though his gaze remained sharp. "Patience, mon ami. The truth reveals itself in time. For now, observe, listen. The little gray cells, they must work over time." The afternoon brought a change in the atmosphere, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Hastings wandered the grounds, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. The gardens were a maze of overgrown paths, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. He found Judith near the old fountain, its stone basin cracked and dry. She was sketching in a small notebook, her pencil moving with quick, confident strokes. "You're awfully quiet today," she said without looking up. "Is it Mr. Poirot? He's got you all wound up, hasn't he?" Hastings sighed, settling onto a nearby bench. "He's convinced there's a murderer among us, someone dangerous, manipulative. I don't know what to make of it." Judith's pencil paused, and she met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "He's always been a bit dramatic, hasn't he? But there's something strange about this place. The people, I mean. Everyone's hiding something." Her words echoed, warning, and Hastings felt a prickle of unease. "What do you mean? Have you noticed something?" She shrugged, closing her notebook. "Just a feeling. Norton's odd, always muttering to himself. And Allerton, he's charming, but it's like he's playing a part. Even the Luttrells seem on edge, like they're waiting for something to go wrong. Hastings studied her, struck by her perceptiveness. "You'll be careful around Allerton," he said, his tone sharper than intended. "I don't trust him." Judith's lips twitched in a half-smile. "Don't worry, father. I can handle myself." Their conversation was cut short by the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Major Allerton appeared, his hands in his pockets, his expression one of casual amusement. "Plotting something, you too?" he asked, his eyes lingering on Judith. "Just enjoying the scenery," Judith replied, her tone cool but not unfriendly. "Though it's a bit bleak for my taste." Allerton chuckled, stepping closer. "Oh, I don't know. There's a certain charm in decay. Makes you appreciate the fleeting beauty of things." Hastings stood, his protective instincts flaring. "We were just heading back," he said, offering Judith his arm. She took it, but not before casting Allerton a lingering glance that made Hastings' stomach twist as they walked back to the house. Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something vital. Poirot's words, Judith's observations, Norton's newspaper, Allerton's charm, it all swirled together in a maddening puzzle. The day wore on, each interaction tinged with a subtle undercurrent of suspicion. At tea, Daisy Luttrell spilled her cup when Norton mentioned a rare bird sighting near the village where the murder in the newspaper had occurred. Colonel Luttrell snapped at her, his patience fraying, and Nurse Craven watched the exchange with a cool, detached interest that sent a shiver down Hastings' spine. By evening, the tension in Styles Court was palpable, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Dinner was a strained affair, the conversation stilted despite Allerton's attempts to lighten the mood with anecdotes. Poirot, unusually quiet, observed the group with an intensity that made Hastings' skin prickle. When the meal ended, Poirot signaled for Hastings to join him in the library, a dimly lit room lined with dusty books and faded portraits. "You have seen much today, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you have not yet seen the truth." Hastings leaned forward, frustration bubbling over. "Then help me see it, Poirot. You say there's a killer here, but all I see are ordinary people with their quirks and secrets. Norton's odd, Allerton's a flirt. The Luttrells are struggling to keep this place afloat. Where's the murderer in that?" Poirot's eyes gleamed, and he raised a finger as if to silence Hastings' doubts. "The murderer, mon ami, is the one who sees what others do not. They watch, they listen, they know the weaknesses of every soul in this house, and they use that knowledge to weave their web." Hastings felt a chill, his mind racing back to the day's events. Norton's newspaper, Judith's unease, Allerton's charm, each piece seemed to fit. Yet the picture remained maddeningly incomplete. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Watch, Hastings. Watch and listen. The killer will betray themselves, but only if you see the signs. The little gray cells, they must be your guide." The conversation ended abruptly when Nurse Craven knocked informing Poirot that it was time for his evening medication. As Hastings left the library, he caught sight of Norton in the hallway, clutching the same newspaper from lunch. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, Hastings saw something in Norton's gaze. Not fear, not guilt, but a quiet, calculating intensity that made his blood run cold. He retired to his room, the weight of Poirot's words pressing down on him. The house was silent, save for the distant creak of floorboards and the howl of the wind outside. As he lay in bed, staring at the shadowed ceiling, Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow Poirot spoke of was watching him, waiting for its moment to strike. The little grey cells, he thought, would need to work harder than ever to unravel the mystery of Styles Court. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Past. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Styles Court, draping the faded grandeur of the old estate in a ghostly shroud. Captain Arthur Hastings stood at his bedroom window, the damp air seeping through the cracked pane, carrying with it the faint scent of wet earth and decaying roses. The house, once a beacon of elegance, now sagged under the weight of neglect, its ivy-clad walls whispering of better days. Hastings' eyes lingered on the garden below, where the silhouettes of the other guests moved like shadows in a dream each one. According to Poirot, a potential piece in a deadly puzzle. He had slept poorly, his dreams haunted by cryptic warning from the previous night. A murderer who did not kill with their own hands, but orchestrated death through others. The idea seemed fantastical, yet Poirot's grave demeanor had rooted it in Hastings' mind like a stubborn weed. He adjusted his tie, its crisp not a small act of defiance against the disarray of styles, and headed downstairs, determined to unravel the threads Poirot had dangled before him. The dining room was a study in contrasts. The chipped grandeur of a mahogany table set with mismatched china, the faint aroma of burnt toast mingling with the sharp tang of coffee. The guests were already gathered, their voices a low hum, like bees in a hive poised to sting. Colonel Luttrell, a wiry man with a soldier's posture and a perpetual scowl, sat at the head, his wife fussing over a teapot that seemed to defy her efforts to pour. Judith, Hastings' daughter, sat across from the charming Major Allerton, her dark eyes flashing with a mix of defiance and curiosity as they spoke. Norton, the ornithologist, hunched over a notebook, his glasses slipping down his nose as he scribbled furiously. Miss Cole, a woman of indeterminate age, with a penchant for lace collars, sipped her tea with a primness that bordered on theatrical. Sir William Boyd Carrington, the retired governor, leaned back in his chair, his booming laugh cutting through the tension like a blunt knife. Hastings took his seat, nodding politely as Mrs. Luttrell offered him a cup of tea. "It's Darjeeling, Captain, though I fear the leaves are a bit stale," she said, her voice tinged with apology. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying the strain of keeping Styles afloat. "Thank you, Mrs. Luttrell," Hastings replied, his gaze drifting to Poirot. Empty chair. The detective had excused himself from breakfast, citing a need to rest. But Hastings suspected he was already plotting. his little grey cells spinning webs in the solitude of his room. The conversation at the table was stilted, each guest navigating the unspoken rules of a house where familiarity bred suspicion. Judith, her auburn hair catching the weak sunlight filtering through the window, was recounting a story about her work with the Botanical Society in London. "They've discovered a new species of orchid in Borneo," she said, her voice animated. "It's parasitic, feeds off the roots of other plants. Quite ruthless, really." Allerton leaned closer, his smile polished to a sheen. "Ruthless beauty, Miss Hastings. Sounds like something you'd admire." Judith's lips twitched, but her eyes narrowed. "I admire resilience, Major, not cruelty." Hastings felt a pang of unease. Allerton's charm was effortless, but there was something calculated in the way he mirrored Judith's energy, like a predator pacing alongside its prey. He made a mental note to speak with her later, though he knew his daughter's stubborn streak would make that conversation a battle. Norton looked up from his notebook, his voice soft but carrying an odd intensity. "Parasites are fascinating, Miss Hastings. They thrive by exploiting others' weaknesses. Like certain birds, the cuckoo, for instance, lays its eggs in another's nest, lets the host raise its young." The table fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling like dust. Miss Cole coughed delicately, setting her cup down with a clink. "Mr. Norton, you do have a way of making nature sound positively sinister." Norton blinked, as if startled by his own thoughts. "Just an observation, Miss Cole. Nature's full of such strategies." Hastings' mind flickered to Poirot's warning. A manipulator, someone who planted seeds of destruction without lifting a finger. Could Norton, with his quiet demeanor and peculiar intensity, be the shadow Poirot hunted? Or was it Allerton, whose charm seemed too polished to be genuine? He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the plate of overcooked eggs before him. The meal was interrupted by the arrival of Nurse Craven, a sharp-featured woman with eyes that seemed to dissect everyone she looked at. She carried a tray of medical supplies, her movements brisk and efficient. "Mrs. Franklin's feeling poorly again," she announced, her tone clipped. "I'll need to adjust her medication." Dr. Franklin, a gaunt man with a perpetually distracted air, looked up from his coffee. "Barbara's always poorly," he muttered, almost to himself. "Too much time indoors, if you ask me." Nurse Craven's lips tightened. "Perhaps if you spend less time with your test tubes, Doctor, she'd have more reason to venture out." The room stilled, the barb landing like a stone in a pond. Dr. Franklin flushed, his fingers tightening around his cup, but he said nothing. Hastings watched the exchange, his instincts prickling. There was a history here, a tension that went beyond professional disagreement. He glanced at Judith, who was studying Nurse Craven with an unreadable expression. As breakfast ended, the guests dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls of Styles. Hastings lingered, his thoughts churning. Poirot had promised to share more about the 5 murders he suspected were linked to their mysterious killer. The prospect both intrigued and unnerved him. He found Poirot in the library, A dim room lined with dusty books and a single armchair where the detective sat, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the day. Mon ami Poirot greeted, his voice soft but clear. You have the look of a man who has seen a ghost. Hastings managed a wry smile, settling into a chair opposite. Not a ghost, Poirot, just too many shadows for my liking. Poirot's eyes gleamed, the only part of him that seemed untouched by age. Shadows, yes, but shadows cast by a very real hand. Sit, Hastings, and let me tell you a story. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. 5 murders, mon ami. 5 deaths that appear unconnected, yet each bears the mark of a single mind. A mind that does not kill with a knife or a gun, but with words, with ideas, with the subtle poison of suggestion. Hastings frowned, his practical mind struggling to grasp the concept. You're saying someone convinced others to commit these murders? How is that possible? Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. It is not only possible, Hastings, it is devastatingly effective. Consider a man who whispers to a jealous husband that his wife is unfaithful, planting the seed of rage, or a woman who suggests to a desperate heir that a certain death would solve all their problems. The killer does not act, they orchestrate. He paused, his gaze distant. Let me tell you of one such case from many years ago. A village in Devon, a quiet place, much like Styles. A young woman, Elizabeth, was found drowned in a river. An accident, they said, until I discovered she had been driven to despair by rumor spread by a trusted friend, a woman who stood to gain from her death. The friend never touched her, never pushed her into the water, but she wove a net of lies so tight that Elizabeth saw no escape but to end her life. Hastings felt a chill, despite the stuffy air of the library. And you think this friend, this manipulator, is here at Styles? Poirot nodded slowly. I know it, Hastings. The pattern is the same. 5 deaths. A businessman poisoned by his partner. A widow who fell from a balcony after a heated argument. A young man shot by his brother in a supposed hunting accident. A girl who overdosed after a betrayal, and a doctor who died in a fire blamed on faulty wiring. Each death was ruled an accident or suicide, yet in each there was a shadower person who stood to gain, who whispered the right words at the right moment. Hastings leaned back, his mind racing. But who? Poirot, you've seen the guests. They're ordinary, eccentric, perhaps, but not diabolical. Poirot's smile was thin, almost pitying. The most dangerous wolves, Hastings, were the fleece of lambs. You must observe, not just with your eyes, but with your heart. The killer is here, among us, and they will strike again unless we stop them. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Luttrell entered, her face pale. Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's been an incident. Hastings stood, his pulse quickening. What kind of incident? It's Nurse Craven, Mrs. Luttrell said, wringing her hands. She and Mrs. Franklin had a dreadful row in the drawing-room. Nurse Craven said something about Mrs. Franklin's condition being self-inflicted, and Mrs. Franklin threw a vase at her. It's all a terrible mess. Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he remained seated. Merci, madame. We will come at once. As they followed Mrs. Luttrell to the drawing-room, Hastings' mind churned. Nurse Craven's accusation echoed Poirot's story of manipulation words that cut deeper than any blade. The drawing-room was in disarray. Shards of porcelain scattered across the carpet. Mrs. Franklin, a pale woman with delicate features, sat trembling on a sofa, her husband hovering awkwardly nearby. Nurse Craven stood by the window, her arms crossed, her expression defiant. "What happened here?" Hastings asked, his voice calm but firm. Mrs. Franklin's voice was barely a whisper. She said, "I'm making myself ill. That I'm weak. It's not true. I'm not weak." Nurse Craven's eyes flashed. "I only said what's obvious, Mrs. Franklin. You cling to your ailments like a lifeline, keeping Dr. Franklin tied to poor you when he'd rather be in his laboratory." Dr. Franklin's face darkened. "That's enough, nurse. You overstep." Poirot raised a hand, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Enough, all of you. Madame Franklin, you are distressed. Rest now, and we will speak later. Nurse Craven, a word, if you please." As the others dispersed, Poirot led Nurse Craven to a corner of the room, his voice low but insistent. Hastings couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw the nurse's face tighten, her hands clenching into fists. When Poirot returned, his expression was unreadable. "What did you say to her?" Hastings asked as they left the drawing-room. "I asked her why she feels the need to wound with her words," Poirot replied, "and I observed her reaction. She is a woman who thrives on control, Hastings. But whether that makes her our killer, that remains to be seen." The rest of the day passed in a haze of suspicion. Hastings found himself watching the guests with new eyes, searching for signs of the manipulator Poirot described. He noticed Norton lingering near the library, his fingers tracing the spines of old crime novels with an almost reverent touch. Judith, meanwhile, seemed distracted, her earlier fire dampened by some private thought. When Hastings tried to speak with her, she brushed him off, her smile tight. "Father, I'm fine," she said, her tone clipped. "You don't need to hover." "I'm not hovering," Hastings protested, stung. "I'm concerned." Her eyes softened, but only for a moment. "Then trust me. I can take care of myself." As evening fell, Hastings took a walk in the garden, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. The roses, overgrown and wild, seemed to mock his attempts at clarity. He was about to return to the house when he heard voices, low, urgent, coming from the direction of the old summer-house. Creeping closer, he recognized the clipped tones of Miss Cole and the rumbling baritone of Boyd Carrington. "Too risky," Miss Cole was saying, her voice barely audible. "If anyone finds out, they won't," Boyd Carrington interrupted, his tone firm. "Not if we're careful. You know what's at stake." Hastings' heart pounded. He strained to hear more, but the voices faded as the two moved away. their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. He stood frozen, his mind racing. What were they hiding? Was this the secret Poirot had hinted at, the thread that tied the killer to Styles? He returned to the house, his resolve hardening. Poirot was right, there was a shadow here, and it was growing darker by the hour. He would watch, he would listen, and he would uncover the truth, no matter how elusive it proved to be. The whispers of the past were growing louder, and Hastings knew they would not stay silent for long. Chapter 4. The Othello motif. The late summer sun hung low over Styles Court, casting long shadows across the lawn where the grass, once meticulously trimmed, now grew unevenly, a testament to the estate's faded glory. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by the open French windows of the drawing-room, the air heavy with the scent of roses and an undercurrent of unease. His eyes followed his daughter, Judith, as she walked arm in arm with Major Allerton through the garden, their laughter drifting back like a melody that grated on his nerves. Hercule Poirot, seated in a wicker chair nearby, his hands folded over the silver handle of his cane, watched Hastings with a knowing glint in his sharp green eyes. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice soft but deliberate. "You observe, but do you see? The heart, it is a fragile thing, and jealousy, it is a poison most subtle." Hastings turned, frowning. "Jealousy. Poirot, you can't seriously think Judith is in danger from Allerton. He's charming, yes, but dangerous. He's practically a boy, full of stories and smiles." Poirot tilted his head, his moustache twitching slightly. "The charm, Hastings, it is a mask. In Shakespeare's Othello, did not Iago weave his web? With smiles and flattery. He plants the seed, and the mind does the rest. Observe your daughter. She is captivated, Nan. And where there is captivation, there is vulnerability." Hastings' jaw tightened. Judith's laughter rang out again, and he caught the way Allerton leaned closer, his hand brushing her arm. It was innocent enough, but Poirot's words gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on being a protective father. Yet Judith, with her fierce independence and sharp intellect, often left him feeling like a bystander in her life. Now, at Styles, where the past seemed to echo in every creak of the floorboards, he felt an unfamiliar dread. "Poirot," Hastings said, lowering his voice, "you're not suggesting Allerton is this manipulator you spoke of? The one behind those murders?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he did not answer directly. "I suggest only that you watch Hastings. Watch the eyes, the gestures, the words left unsaid. The killer, he or she, does not wield the knife. They wield the mind." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Luttrell, her apron dusted with flour from the kitchen. Her face, lined with years of managing Styles as a guest-house, was pinched with irritation. "Captain Hastings, Monsieur, tea will be served in the conservatory shortly. I trust you'll join us. The others are already gathering." "Merci, Madame Luttrell," Poirot replied with a polite nod. "We shall be there." As she bustled away, Hastings caught Poirot's gaze lingering on the garden, where Judith and Allerton had paused by a crumbling stone fountain. The Major was gesturing animatedly pointing to the sky, as if tracing constellations, though it was still daylight. Judith's smile was unguarded, and Hastings felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name fear, perhaps, or the ache of losing influence over his daughter. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, rising with difficulty and leaning on his cane. "Let us join the others. The conservatory. It is a stage, and we must observe the players." The conservatory was a glass-walled relic of Styles' grander days, its panes streaked with age, but still admitting a golden glow. The guests were scattered across wicker chairs and mismatched sofas, an eclectic ensemble that seemed both out of place and perfectly suited to the house's faded charm. Colonel Luttrell, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, was engrossed in a newspaper, muttering about the state of the world. Miss Cole, a woman of indeterminate age with a penchant for cryptic remarks, sipped her tea with a delicate precision that belied her sharp gaze. Nurse Craven, her dark hair pulled back tightly, was whispering something to Barbara Franklin, whose pale face and nervous hands suggested fragility, or perhaps something more calculated. Dr. John Franklin, Barbara's husband, stood apart, his attention fixed on a notebook filled with scrawled equations. His disheveled hair and ink-stained fingers spoke of a man consumed by his work, oblivious to the social currents around him. Norton, the quiet ornithologist, sat near the window, his binoculars resting on his lap as he stared out at the garden. Though Hastings suspected he was watching Judith and Allerton as much as any bird, Poirot settled into a chair near the tea-table, his small frame almost swallowed by the cushions. Hastings took a seat beside him, his eyes flicking between the guests. The atmosphere was cordial but strained, like a string quartet playing slightly out of tune. Mrs. Luttrell poured tea with a practiced smile, but her eyes darted to her husband, who hadn't looked up from his paper. "Major Allerton seems quite taken with your daughter, Captain," Miss Cole said suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. Her tone was light, but there was a probing edge to it, as if she were testing the waters. Hastings forced a smile. "Judith's always been one for lively company. She's got a good head on her shoulders." "Indeed," Miss Cole replied, her lips curving faintly. "Though young women can be swayed by charm, can't they? I recall a time when I was her age, and a certain gentleman's flattery nearly led me astray." She paused, her eyes locking onto Hastings. "It's the ones who seem harmless that you must watch." Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on his cane, a subtle signal that he was listening intently. Before Hastings could respond, Barbara Franklin coughed delicately, drawing attention. "Oh, I don't know," she said, her voice soft but carrying. "Major Allerton is such a gentleman. He was telling me about his travels in India yesterdays. Fascinating. Don't you think, John?" Dr. Franklin looked up from his notebook, blinking as if startled to be addressed. "H.M.O. Allerton. Yes, talks a lot. Bit of a showman, isn't he?" His tone was distracted, and he returned to his notes without waiting for a reply. Barbara's smile faltered, and Nurse Craven patted her hand. "Don't mind him, dear. Men like Dr. Franklin are married to their work, not their wives. The comment was delivered with a laugh, but there was a bite to it that made Hastings glance at Poirot. The detective's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on Nurse Craven. The door to the conservatory opened, and Judith and Allerton entered, their faces flushed from the sun. Judith's dark hair was slightly tousled, and Allerton's grin was as bright as ever. "Sorry we're late," he said, his voice carrying a practiced ease. "Miss Hastings was giving me a lesson in botany, turns out. I'm hopeless with plants." Judith laughed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He's not hopeless, just impatient. You can't rush a rose, Major. Nor a lady, I'm told," Allerton quipped, winking at the room. The remark drew a chuckle from Mrs. Luttrell and a tight smile from Colonel Luttrell, who finally lowered his newspaper. Hastings felt his hands clench. Allerton's charm was effortless, but there was something calculated in the way he moved through the room, acknowledging each guest with just the right word or glance. Poirot's earlier warning echoed in his mind. "The killer wields the mind. Tea, Major," Mrs. Luttrell offered, holding up a pot. "Delighted, thank you," Allerton replied, settling into a chair near Judith. As he did, Hastings noticed Norton's binoculars shift slightly, the lenses glinting as they caught the light. Was he watching Allerton or something else? Poirot cleared his throat, a small sound that somehow commanded attention. "Mademoiselle Judith," he said, his voice warm but pointed, "you have an interest in botany. Tell me, do you know the oleander, a beautiful plant but deadly, Nan? Its leaves, they can kill with a single touch if one is not careful." Judith's eyes sparkled with interest. "I've read about oleander, Monsieur Poirot. Its fascinating beauty and danger in one package. But you'd need to know what you're doing to use it as a poison. It's not exactly subtle." "Subtlety," Poirot said, his gaze sweeping the room, "is overrated. Sometimes the bold stroke is the most effective. Do you not agree, Major Allerton?" Allerton's smile didn't waver, but his eyes flicked to Poirot, a brief shadow crossing his face. "Oh, I'm all for boldness, Monsieur Poirot. Subtleties for people with too much time on their hands." The exchange was light, but Hastings felt a chill. Poirot was baiting Allerton, testing him, and the Major's response was just a shade too quick, too polished. Across the room, Miss Cole's fingers tightened around her teacup, and Nurse Craven's smile seemed frozen. Even Dr. Franklin, usually oblivious, glanced up, his pen pausing mid-stroke. The conversation shifted to trivial matters, whether the state of the roads, but Hastings couldn't shake the sense that every word was a move in a game he didn't fully understand. Poirot's reference to Othello lingered, and he found himself watching Judith and Allerton with growing unease. Was Allerton playing the role of Iago, planting seeds of discord, or was Poirot's suspicion misdirected, a product of his failing health and obsession with this unseen killer? As the tea hour drew to a close, Barbara Franklin rose, swaying slightly. "I think I'll rest before dinner," she said, her voice faint. Nurse Craven was at her side in an instant. guiding her out with a proprietary air. Dr. Franklin didn't look up, but Hastings noticed Judith watching the scene, her expression unreadable. "Judith," Hastings said, catching her as the others began to disperse a word. She raised an eyebrow, her independence flaring. "If it's about Major Allerton, Father, I'm not a child. I can handle myself." "I know you can," he said, forcing a smile. "But humor an old man. Just be careful. Poirot's worried, and that's enough to make me worry." Judith's expression softened, but only slightly. "Monsieur Poirot sees mysteries everywhere. I like Allerton's company, that's all. There's no need to invent conspiracies." She walked away, leaving Hastings standing alone in the conservatory. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows deepened. He thought of Poirot's warning of Iago and Othello, and wondered if Judith was the Desdemona in this unfolding drama, something else entirely. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair, the dining room lit by flickering candles that did little to dispel the gloom. The food was simple roast chicken, overcooked vegetables, but Mrs. Luttrell's efforts to keep the conversation lively fell flat. Colonel Luttrell was gruff, snapping at a spilled glass of wine, and Barbara Franklin, though present, looked paler than ever, her eyes darting nervously. Poirot, seated at the head of the table, was unusually quiet, his fork moving with mechanical precision. Hastings, opposite him, tried to catch his eye, but the detective's attention was elsewhere, flitting from guest to guest, like a hawk tracking movement in the grass. Allerton, ever the charmer, regaled the table with a story about a tiger hunt in India, his hands animated as he described the chase. Judith listened, her chin resting on her hand, a faint smile playing on her lips. Hastings wanted to interrupt, to pull her away, but Poirot's earlier words held him back. "Observe, do not act." Norton, seated at the far end, was silent, his eyes fixed on his plate, but Hastings noticed him glance at Allerton. Whenever the Major's voice rose, a flicker of something resentment, perhaps, in his expression. Miss Cole, meanwhile, was watching Poirot, her gaze sharp and calculating, as the meal ended. Dr. Franklin excused himself, muttering about a breakthrough in his research. Barbara watched him go, her lips tightening, and Nurse Craven leaned in to whisper something that made her nod. Hastings caught Poirot's eye at last, and the detective gave a slight nod, as if confirming a shared suspicion. After dinner, the guests drifted to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Allerton suggested a game of bridge, and Judith eagerly agreed, partnering with him against Miss Cole and Boyd Carrington, a jovial older man who had been largely silent during dinner. Hastings declined to play, choosing instead to sit near Poirot, who was pretending to read a book but was clearly listening to every word. "Father," Judith called, her voice teasing, "you're not going to sit there brooding all night, are you'd join us?" "I'm fine here," Hastings replied, forcing a smile. "You young people enjoy yourselves." Allerton grinned. "Wise man, Captain. Bridge is a young person's game full of bluffs and bold moves. Poirot's book lowered slightly. A game of strategy, Major, he said, but also of trust. One must know one's partner, Nan. To misjudge that is to lose. Allerton's grin didn't falter, but his eyes flicked to Poirot, a challenge in them. "Oh, I always choose my partners carefully, Monsieur Poirot. No misjudgments here." The game began, and Hastings watched, his mind racing. Poirot's Othello analogy was impossible to ignore. Allerton's charm, Judith's growing attachment, the subtle tensions among the guests, it all felt like a stage, set for tragedy. But who was pulling the strings? Was it Allerton, with his easy smiles and quick wit, or someone quieter, like Norton, whose unassuming demeanor might hide a sharper mind? As the evening wore on, Hastings noticed Barbara Franklin slip out of the room, her face pale. Nurse Craven followed a moment later, her expression unreadable. He glanced at Poirot, who gave a subtle shake of his head, as if to say, "Not yet." The bridge game ended with Allerton and Judith victorious, their laughter filling the room. Miss Cole, however, was less amused. Her lips pursed as she gathered the cards. "You're a formidable pair," she said, her tone clipped. "Almost too perfect," Judith laughed, but Allerton's smile was sharper. "Practice makes perfect, Miss Cole. Perhaps we'll have a rematch tomorrow." As the guests began to retire, Hastings approached Poirot, who was lingering by the fire. "Well," he whispered, "did you see anything?" "Allerton's got Judith wrapped around his finger, and I don't like it." Poirot's eyes gleamed in firelight. "Patience, mon ami. The killer. They play a long game. Tonight we have seen the pieces move, but the board is not yet clear. Watch Mademoiselle Judith, but also watch the others. The one who seems least likely, that is the one to fear." Hastings nodded, though his heart was heavy. As he climbed the stairs to his room, the house seemed to close in around him, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. Styles Court was no longer just a faded guest house, it was a chessboard, and he feared Judith was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The next morning, Hastings awoke to a grey sky, the air thick with the promise of rain. He found Poirot in the library, surrounded by books, but staring out the window, his cane resting across his knees. The detective's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "You didn't sleep, Hastings," said, more a statement than a question. Poirot smiled faintly. "The little grey cells, they do not rest. Last night I thought much of our friend Othello. The tragedy. It begins with a whisper suggestion that festers. I fear such a whisper is already at work here." Hastings sat across from him, his voice low. "Allerton, you think he's planting ideas in Judith's head, don't you? Trying to, what? Turn her against someone?" Poirot's gaze was steady. "Perhaps. Or perhaps he seeks to use her in another way. But it is not only Allerton we must watch. The killer. They are a chameleon, blending into the background. They may not be the loudest voice in the room." Hastings thought of Norton, of Miss Cole. of Nurse Craven's sharp remarks. "You're saying it could be anyone. Anyone. But the motive, Hastings, it is not greed or revenge in the usual sense. It is control. The killer delights in bending others to their will, in watching the chaos unfold. That is why I speak of Othello. The tragedy is not the act, but the manipulation that leads to it." Before Hastings could respond, the library door opened, and Judith entered, her face bright despite the gloomy morning. "Good morning, Father, Monsieur Poirot. I hope I'm not interrupting a grand conspiracy." Poirot's smile was warm, but his eyes were searching. "Not at all, mademoiselle. We were merely discussing the weather. It promises rain, Nan." Judith laughed, moving to put a bookshelf. "Rain suits styles, don't you think? It's got that melancholic charm." As she browsed the shelves, Hastings watched her, his heart aching. She was so vibrant, so full of life, and yet Poirot's warnings made him see shadows everywhere. He glanced at the detective, who was studying Judith with an intensity that made Hastings' stomach twist. "Judith," he said, keeping his tone light, "you and Allerton seem to get on well. What do you make of him?" She turned a book in her hand, her expression playful but guarded. "He's fun, Father. He doesn't take life too seriously, which is refreshing. Why? Don't tell me you're jealous of a bit of harmless flirtation." Hastings flushed. "Not jealous, just cautious. You're my daughter, after all." Her smile softened, but there was a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I know, Father, but I'm not a damsel in distress. I can handle Major Allerton or anyone else." As she left the library, Poirot leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "She is strong, Hastings, but strength can be a weakness when it blinds one to danger. Keep her close, but do not push her away. The killer will use any rift to their advantage." Hastings nodded, his resolve hardening. He would watch Judith, watch Allerton, watch everyone. Styles Court was a puzzle, and he would not let Poirot, his daughter, down. The day unfolded slowly, the guests moving through their routines with a surface calm that belied the undercurrents Hastings now saw everywhere. He joined Poirot for a walk in the garden, where the roses were beginning to wilt under the weight of impending rain. They passed Dr. Franklin, who was crouched over a patch of soil, collecting samples for some experiment. His wife, Barbara, sat on a nearby bench, her face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. "Dr. Franklin," Poirot called, his tone genial. "Your work, it consumes you, Nan. What is it you study so intently?" Franklin looked up, blinking as if surprised to be addressed. "Soil chemistry, Monsieur Poirot. The balance of nutrients, it's the key to life, you know. One wrong element, and everything collapses." Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "A balance, we, like the mind. Perhaps one wrong thought," and he trailed off, letting the words hang. Franklin frowned, then returned to his work. Barbara, however, looked up, her eyes meeting Poirot's for a fleeting moment. There was something in her gaze, fear, perhaps, or calculations, Skin Prickle. As they continued their walk, Poirot spoke softly. The Franklins, Hastings, they are a study in contrasts. He is lost in his science, she in her fragility. But is it genuine, this fragility, or is it a performance? Hastings glanced back at Barbara, who was now watching her husband with a strange intensity. You think she's playing a part? I think, Poirot said, that everyone at Styles is playing a part. The question is, who writes the script? They reached the stone fountain where Judith and Allerton had stood the previous day. The water was still, reflecting the grey sky. Poirot paused, his cane tapping the ground. This place, Hastings, it is a mirror. It shows us what we wish to see, but also what we fear. You fear for Judith, Nan. Of course I do, Hastings said, his voice rough. She's my daughter, Poirot. If Allerton or anyone hurts her. Poirot placed a hand on his arm, a rare gesture of comfort. We will not let it come to that, mon ami, but you must trust me. The killer is here, and they are watching us as closely as we watch them. The Othello motifit is not just jealousy, but betrayal. And betrayal, it comes from those we trust most. Hastings' heart sank. He thought of Judith's defiance, of Allerton's charm, of the countless small interactions that now seemed laden with meaning. Styles' court was a labyrinth, and he was beginning to fear they were all trapped within it. As the afternoon waned, Boraine began, a soft patter that grew into a steady drum. The guests gathered in the drawing-room, some reading, others playing cards. Judith was absent, and Hastings' inquiries revealed she had gone to the village with Allerton to post a letter. His unease grew, but Poirot, seated by the fire, seemed unperturbed, his eyes half closed, as if in meditation. Norton approached, his binoculars dangling from his neck. "Captain Hastings," he said, his voice hesitant, I found something. In the garden this morning, a scrap of paper near the fountain. It might be nothing, but he handed Hastings a crumpled note, the ink smudged but legible. Meet me at midnight. The truth must stay buried. There was no signature, no indication of who had written it, or to whom it was addressed. Hastings showed it to Poirot, whose eyes snapped open. "Interessant," he murmured, turning the paper over in his hands. "The handwriting, it is careful, disguised. But the message, it is a challenge. Someone at Styles is planning a rendezvous, and they do not wish to be discovered. Midnight," Hastings said, his pulse quickening. "We should be there, Poirot. Catch them in the act." Poirot's smile was faint but sharp. "Non, Hastings. We do not catch a shadow by chasing it. We let it come to us. Tonight you will watch, but from a distance, and you will tell no one, not even Judith." Hastings nodded, though his mind was racing. The note, the fountain, the rain, all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. As he looked round the drawing-room, at the guests absorbed in their small worlds, he felt the weight of Poirot's words. The killer was here, hidden among them, and the game was far from over. The chapter closed with the rain beating against the windows, A relentless rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of styles caught itself a house alive with secrets, waiting for the next move in a deadly dance. Chapter 5. A poisoned mind. The morning at Styles Court broke with a deceptive calm, the kind that cloaks a storm. Sunlight filtered through the heavy drapes of the dining room, casting long, lazy shadows across the faded wallpaper. The air was thick with the scent of oversteeped tea and slightly burnt toast, a testament to Mrs. Luttrell's harried attempts to keep the guest-house running smoothly. Captain Arthur Hastings sat at the long oak table, his fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on the chipped porcelain of his teacup. His eyes darted toward the door each time a guest entered, searching for a telltale sign of guilt, a flicker of deceit. Hercule Poirot's warning from the previous night echoed in his mind. We hunt a shadow, mon ami, but a shadow that kills. Across the table, Judith Hastings, his daughter, stirred her tea with a distracted air, her auburn hair catching the light as she tilted her head. She was a vision of restless energy, her sharp mind always seeking something to challenge it. Beside her sat Major Allerton, his easy smile and polished charm a stark contrast to the tension coiling in Hastings' chest. The other guests, Luttrell, his wife, Nurse Craven, Miss Cole, Dr. Franklin, his fragile wife, Barbara Boyd Carrington, and the quiet ornithologist Norton moved through the morning ritual with varying degrees of engagement. Some chatted lightly, others retreated into silence, but all seemed to carry an invisible weight, as if Poirot's cryptic revelations had seeped into the very walls of Styles. Poirot himself was absent, confined to his room by the arthritis that gnawed at his joints. Hastings felt a pang of guilt for resenting his friend's secrecy, but Poirot's insistence on withholding the suspect's identity gnawed at him. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot had said, his green eyes glinting with that familiar intensity. "The truth lies in what they do not say." And so Hastings observed, his gaze lingering on Norton, who sat in the corner, his nose buried in a tattered bird-watching journal, though his eyes seemed to linger too long on the others. The breakfast was interrupted by a sharp cry from the kitchen. Mrs. Luttrell burst through the swinging door, her face flushed and her hands trembling. "By Mrs. Franklin, she's taken ill." The room froze, forks clattering against plates. Hastings shot to his feet, his heart lurching as he followed the others to the drawing-room, where Barbara Franklin lay slumped on a chaise longue, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Nurse Craven was already at her side, loosening the collar of Barbara's dress with practiced efficiency. "What happened?" Hastings demanded, his voice sharper than intended. "She was fine at breakfast," Mrs. Luttrell stammered, wringing her hands. "Then she took her tea in here, and not 5 minutes later she was clutching her chest, gasping." Nurse Craven's dark eyes flicked up, her expression unreadable. It could be her heart. "She's always been delicate. I'll fetch her medication." She moved swiftly toward the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Judith knelt beside Barbara, her brow furrowed with concern. "She's clammy," she murmured, pressing a hand to Barbara's forehead, and her pulse is weak. Hastings glanced at Allerton, who stood at the edge of the room, his hands in his pockets, his expression one of detached curiosity. "Shouldn't we call a doctor?" Hastings asked, his voice tight. "Dr. Franklin's here," Boyd Carrington offered, gesturing to the scientist, who had just entered, his glasses slightly askew. Dr. Franklin knelt beside his wife, his face a mask of clinical detachment as he checked her pulse. "It's not her heart," he said curtly. "She's had these spells before. Likely a reaction to something she ate or drank." His eyes flicked to the teacup on the side table, its contents half spilled onto the saucer. Hastings' stomach twisted. Something she drank. Poirot's words from the previous day surfaced. The killer plants ideas, Hastings. But sometimes they plant more than that. He stepped closer to the teacup, careful not to touch it. The liquid inside was a murky amber, not unlike the tea served at breakfast. But a faint, acrid scent lingered, one that didn't belong. Judith Hastings said quietly, "Fetch Poirot. He needs to see this." Judith hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "You think someone did this deliberately?" "I don't know," Hastings admitted, his voice low. "But Poirot will." As Judith hurried upstairs, the room buzzed with nervous energy. Colonel Luttrell muttered about the state of the house's plumbing, while Miss Cole hovered near the window, her fingers twisting the hem of her cardigan. Norton, still clutching his journal, watched the scene with an intensity that made Hastings' skin prickle. Poirot arrived moments later, leaning heavily on his cane, his face pale but his eyes sharp as ever. He took in the scene with a single glance, then hobbled to the chaise longue. "Madame Franklin," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that belied his scrutiny. "Can you tell me what you felt?" Barbara's eyes fluttered open, her voice a weak rasp. "Dizzy. My throat burned, like I couldn't breathe." Poirot's gaze shifted to the teacup. "And this, it was your tea?" She nodded faintly. I poured it myself." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign Hastings recognized as the detective's mind racing. "Monsieur Hastings," he said, beckoning him closer, "secure that cup. Touch it only with a cloth." Hastings obeyed, wrapping the cup in a napkin and placing it on a tray. The room watched in uneasy silence as Poirot turned to Nurse Craven, who had returned with a small vial of medicine. "Mademoiselle," he said, his tone deceptively mild, "you prepared the tea this morning, Nan." Nurse Craven's jaw tightened. "I set out the pot, yes, but everyone helped themselves. I wasn't watching who poured what, indeed," Poirot murmured, his eyes scanning the room. "And yet only Madame Franklin is ill." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Hastings felt a chill, his mind racing through the possibilities. Was this the work of Poirot's shadowy killer, or was it a coincidence, a simple case of food poisoning? He glanced at Judith, who stood by the door, her expression unreadable. The thought of her being in danger tightened his chest. Poirot dismissed, put the group, asking only Hastings and Dr. Franklin to remain. As the others filed out, Norton lingered, his journal now closed, his fingers tapping nervously against its cover. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, his voice high and strained. "Nan," Mercy Poirot said, waving him off. "But do not stray far, Monsieur Norton. I may have questions." Once alone, Poirot examined the teacup, sniffing it carefully. "There is something here," he said, his voice low. "A bitterness not of tea. We must have it analyzed, Hastings. But I suspect—" He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "Poison," Hastings whispered, his heart pounding. "Perhaps," Poirot said, his tone grim. "But if it is, it was done with care. The killer. They do not act directly. They create the opportunity, and others, they take it." Dr. Franklin, who had been silent, spoke up, his voice sharp. "You're suggesting someone poisoned my wife deliberately. That's absurd. She's frail. Always has been. This could be anything: spoiled milk, a bad batch of tea." Poirot tilted his head, studying Franklin. "And yet, monsieur, you were quick to dismiss her heart as the cause. You knew it was something she ingested. Why?" Franklin's face reddened. "I'm a doctor. I know her symptoms." "We," Poirot said, his voice soft but unyielding. "And you are a man of science." "None. Tell me, have you been experimenting with anything unusual in your laboratory?" Franklin stiffened. "My work is confidential. It has nothing to do with this." Poirot smiled faintly, a smile that held no warmth. "We shall see, monsieur." As Franklin stormed out, Hastings turned to Poirot. "You think he's involved?" Poirot sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I think, mon ami, that everyone here has secrets. The killer, they exploit these secrets, these weaknesses. They whisper, they suggest, and others act. But this," he gestured to the teacup, "this is bold. Too bold, perhaps." Hastings spent the afternoon in a state of restless vigilance, his eyes following the guests as they moved through stiles. He decided to speak with Norton, whose nervous demeanor at breakfast had lingered in his mind. He found the ornithologist in the garden, peering through binoculars at a distant tree. "Anything interesting?" Hastings asked, forcing a casual tone. Norton lowered the binoculars, his eyes darting to Hastings before returning to the tree. "Just a pair of chaffinches. Nothing remarkable." Hastings nodded, studying Norton's hands, which trembled slightly. "You seemed shaken this morning. About Mrs. Franklin, I mean." Norton's lips twitched. "It's upsetting, isn't it? A woman like that, so delicate. It's a shame." "Poirot thinks it might not have been an accident," Hastings said, watching for a reaction. Norton's fingers tightened around the binoculars. "An accident, you mean? Someone meant to harm her?" "It's possible," Hastings said, keeping his voice neutral. "You've been here a while. Notice anything odd? Anyone acting strangely?" Norton hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the house. I don't know. People keep to themselves, mostly. But," he lowered his voice, "Miss Cole, she's been asking questions about the Franklins, about their marriage. It's unsettling." Hastings frowned. "What kind of questions?" Personal ones, Norton said, his voice barely above a whisper. About whether Dr. Franklin neglects his wife. Whether she's happy. It's not my place to say, but it felt like she was digging. Hastings filed the information away, his mind racing. Miss Cole had seemed reserved, almost invisible, but perhaps that was her strength. He thanked Norton and returned to the house, his thoughts a tangle of suspicion that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting stiles in a golden glow. Hastings took a walk through the overgrown gardens, hoping to clear his head. The air was heavy with the scent of roses and damp earth, but it did little to ease his unease. He paused by the greenhouse, its glass panes fogged with condensation. On a whim, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The greenhouse was a jungle of neglected plants, their leaves curling in the humid air. Hastings wandered through the rows, his mind elsewhere, until his foot brushed against something hard. He knelt, brushing aside a tangle of vines, and froze. There, half hidden beneath a pot, was a small glass vial. Its label faded but legible. Strychnine. His heart raced as he carefully lifted the vial with his handkerchief. Strychnine was a poison, one Poirot had mentioned in connection to one of the 5 murders. Was this a coincidence, or had the killer been careless? He hurried back to the house, the vial burning a hole in his pocket. Poirot was in his room, a tray of untouched soup beside him. His face lit up when he saw the vial. "Mon Dieu, Hastings, you have found something." He took the vial, turning it over in his hands. This is no accident. The killer, they grow bold, but also sloppy. Could it be Franklin Hastings? Asked. He's a scientist. He'd have access to poisons. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Possible, but unlikely. The killer does not act so directly. This vial. It was meant to be found, perhaps, to cast suspicion. On whom? Hastings pressed. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. That, mon ami, is what we must discover. As night fell, Hastings lay awake, the vial's discovery gnawing at him. Judith's face flashed in his mind, her growing closeness to Allerton a constant worry. Was she a pawn in the killer's game, or something more? And Norton, his nervous demeanor, his cryptic comments about Miss Cole, could he be trusted? The house seemed to pulse with secrets, each guest a potential shadow. The next morning, Hastings resolved to confront Judith. He found her in the library, poring over a book of poetry. "Judith," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk about Allerton." She looked up, her eyes flashing. "What about him?" "He's charming. I'll grant you that," Hastings said, choosing his words carefully. "But there's something about him I don't trust." "You've been spending a lot of time with him." Judith's cheeks flushed. "You're being ridiculous, father." "He's kind, intelligent, perhaps," Hastings interrupted. "But Poirot thinks someone here is dangerous. I don't want you caught in the middle." Judith slammed the book shut. "I'm not a child. I can take care of myself." "I know you can," Hastings said, his voice softening. "But I'm your father, and I worry. Just be careful." She softened slightly, but her eyes were still guarded. "I will, but you need to trust me." As she left, Hastings felt a pang of helplessness. Poirot's words echoed in his mind. The killer thrives on emotional chaos. Was Judith being manipulated, or was he letting his fears cloud his judgment? The day passed in a blur of suspicion and half-formed theories. Hastings watched the guests closely, noting every glance, every whispered conversation. Miss Cole avoided him, her eyes darting away when he entered a room. Boyd Carrington seemed overly cheerful, as if hiding something. Even Colonel Luttrell, usually gruff but predictable, seemed on edge, snapping at his wife over trivial matters. That evening, Poirot summoned Hastings to his room. The detective looked frailer than ever, but his voice was steady. "Hastings, you have done well to find the vial, but we must be cautious. The killer knows we are close. They will act again, and soon." "What do we do?" Hastings asked, his frustration spilling over. "You keep saying the killer's here, but you won't tell me who." Poirot's eyes softened. "Because, mon ami, if I tell you, you will act rashly. You must trust me. Observe, deduce, and protect those you love." Hastings nodded, though his heart was heavy. As he left Poirot's room, he caught sight of Norton in the hallway, his journal clutched to his chest, his eyes wide with something like fear. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Hastings felt a chill. Was Norton the shadow Poirot hunted, or just another pawn in a deadly game? The chapter closed with Hastings standing at his window, staring out at the darkened grounds of Styles. The vial of strychnine sat on his dresser, a silent accusation. Somewhere in the house, a killer moved unseen, their whispers poisoning minds, as surely as any toxin. And Hastings, torn between protecting Judith and trusting Poirot, knew the truth was closer than ever on, more dangerous. Chapter 6. The Game of Trust. The late summer sun dipped below the horizon, casting Styles caught in a twilight glow that seemed to deepen the shadows lurking in its corners. Captain Arthur Hastings sat in the drawing-room, his fingers drumming absently on the armrest of a faded velvet chair. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax polish, but it was the weight of Hercule Poirot's words from earlier that pressed most heavily on his mind. "The killer is closer than we think," mon ami Poirot had said, his voice low, his eyes piercing despite the frailty of his frame. Those words had burrowed into Hastings' thoughts, gnawing at his sense of trust in the eclectic group of guests now gathered at Styles. The room buzzed with the low hum of conversation, punctuated by the clink of teacups and the occasional burst of laughter from Colonel Luttrell, who was regaling Boyd Carrington with a story about a hunting expedition gone awry. Across the room, Judith, Hastings' daughter, sat near the window, her dark hair catching the last glimmers of light. She was engrossed in a book, but her eyes flicked occasionally toward Major Allerton, who lounged with an easy charm, his smile a touch too polished for Hastings' liking. Norton, the ornithologist, sat alone in a corner, his glasses glinting as he scribbled notes in a small leather-bound journal. Nurse Craven, brisk and efficient, was tending to Mrs. Franklin, who reclined a chaise longue, her delicate features drawn with a petulant frown. Miss Cole, the quiet spinster, hovered near the fireplace, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief as she listened to the others. Hastings' gaze lingered on each guest. Searching for the shadow Poirot had warned, the manipulator, who orchestrated murder without ever touching the weapon. The idea seemed fantastical, yet Poirot's certainty was unshakable. Hastings had seen that look in his friend's eyes before, the gleam of a mind piecing together a puzzle only he could see. But tonight Poirot was absent, confined to his room by a flare-up of his arthritis. His absence left Hastings feeling like a knight without his general, tasked with guarding a castle under siege by an invisible enemy. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Luttrell bustled in, carrying a tray of biscuits. Her cheerful demeanor clashed with the tension Hastings felt coiling in his chest. "Now, who's for a bit of shortbread?" she called, her voice bright but strained, as if she too sensed the undercurrents in the room. She set the tray down, and the guests murmured their thanks, though few reached for the offering. Hastings noticed Judith's eyes narrow as Allerton took a biscuit, his fingers brushing Mrs. Luttrell's hand in a way that seemed deliberate. Judith's lips tightened, and she returned to her book with a sharp turn of the page. Hastings rose, his unease propelling him toward the window where Judith sat. "You're awfully quiet tonight," he said, keeping his tone light despite the knot in his stomach. "Everything all right?" Judith glanced up, her expression guarded. "I'm fine, Father. Just reading." Her voice was clipped, and she didn't meet his eyes. Hastings hesitated, wanting to press further, but wary of pushing her away. Their relationship had grown strained in recent years, her fierce independence clashing with his protective instincts. He noticed Allerton watching them from across the room, his smile fading into something more calculating. Before Hastings could respond, a sharp voice cut through the room. "I say, Allerton, you're cheating." Colonel Luttrell's accusation rang out, drawing every eye to the card table where he and Allerton had been playing a game of bridge with Boyd Carrington and Nurse Craven. The colonel's face was flushed, his moustache quivering with indignation. "You palmed that ace. I saw it." Allerton raised his hands, his smile returning like a mask slipping into place. "My dear Colonel, I assure you, I'm playing fair. Perhaps your eyes are playing tricks." His tone was smooth, but there was an edge to it, a challenge that made the air crackle. Boyd Carrington chuckled, trying to diffuse the tension. "Come now, Luttrell, it's just a game. No need to get hot under the collar." But the colonel wasn't appeased. He slammed his cards down, the table rattling. "A game, is it? I don't take kindly to being made a fool of, sir." He glared at Allerton, who leaned back in his chair, unruffled, his eyes glinting with amusement. Hastings watched the exchange, his mind racing. Was this the kind of manipulation Poirot had warned about? A small spark of discord, fanned into flame by a clever hand. He glanced at Judith, who had set her book aside and was watching the scene with an intensity that unnerved him. Her fingers gripped the armrest, and for a moment He saw not his daughter, but a young woman caught in a web he couldn't yet see. Nurse Craven stood, her movements brisk. "Gentlemen, please. This is hardly the place for such nonsense." Her tone was sharp, but her eyes darted nervously toward Mrs. Franklin, who was watching the argument with a faint, almost predatory smile. Hastings felt a chill. Was Mrs. Franklin's frailty an act, as Poirot had hinted, or was she another pawn in this deadly game? The argument fizzled out as Mrs. Luttrell intervened, coaxing the colonel back to his seat with a promise of fresh tea. But the tension lingered, a palpable presence that seemed to settle into the very walls of Styles. Hastings excused himself, his mind buzzing with Poirot's challenge to observe and deduce. He needed air, a moment to clear his head and make sense of the fragments he'd gathered. Outside, the night was cool. The garden bathed in moonlight. The rose bushes, once meticulously tended, were now overgrown, their thorns catching at Hastings' coat as he wandered the path. He paused by a stone bench, his thoughts circling back to Poirot's words. "The killer is closer than we think." Did that mean physically close, here at Styles, or emotionally close? Someone trusted, someone unsuspected. The idea made his stomach churn, especially when he thought of Judith. Her secretive behavior, her fascination with Allerton. Was she in danger, or was she part of something darker? A rustle in the bushes startled him, and he turned to see Norton emerging from the shadows, his bird-watching binoculars dangling from his neck. "Captain Hastings," Norton said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Couldn't sleep either." Hastings forced a smile, though his instincts screamed caution. "Just needed some air." "You're up late." Norton adjusted his glasses, his eyes darting to the house. "I find the night best for observing certain behaviors." He paused, then added, "You're a friend of Monsieur Poirot, aren't you? He's a remarkable man, always seeing what others miss." The comment felt like a probe, and Hastings kept his response vague. "He's certainly one of a kind." "What brings you out here, Norton?" "Spotting owls." Norton chuckled, but it was a nervous sound, something like that. "Though, I confess, I'm more interested in human nature these days. People are unpredictable, don't you think?" Hastings nodded, his mind flashing to the newspaper clipping he'd seen Norton studying a story about a murder that matched one of Poirot's cases. Was Norton merely curious, or was there something more unpredictable? "Yes," Hastings said carefully, "and sometimes dangerous." Norton's smile faltered, and he excused himself, disappearing back toward the house. Hastings watched him go, his unease growing. He was about to return inside when he heard a soft footfall behind him. Spinning around, he saw Judith, her face pale in the moonlight. "Father, what are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "I could ask you the same," he replied, trying to keep his tone gentle. "You've been distant. Is something wrong?" Judith crossed her arms, her eyes flashing. "I'm not a child, Father. I don't need you hovering over me. I'm perfectly capable of handling myself." Her defiance stung, but Hastings pressed on. "It's not about capability, Judith. It's about safety." There's something not right here. Poirot thinks. Poirot thinks everyone's a criminal, she snapped. He's old and paranoid, and you're letting him drag you into his delusions. She softened slightly, her voice dropping. I'm fine, really. I need space. Hastings wanted to argue, to warn her about Allerton, but the distance between them felt like a chasm. Just be careful, he said. Finally, please. Judith nodded curtly and turned back to the house, leaving Hastings alone in the garden. He stood there, the night air cold against his skin, his mind a tangle of doubt and fear. Poirot's game of trust was proving more complex than he'd imagined, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing his friend and his daughter back inside. The drawing room was quieter now. The guests dispersed to their rooms. Hastings climbed the stairs to Poirot's room, determined to share what he'd observed. He knocked softly, and Poirot's voice, weak but clear, bid him enter. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting shadows across Poirot's face. He lay propped up in bed, a blanket draped over his thin frame, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Mon ami, you look troubled," he said, gesturing for Hastings to sit. "What have you seen?" Hastings recounted the evening, the card game, argument, Norton's odd behavior, Judith's secrecy. Poirot listened, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. When Hastings finished, Poirot nodded slowly. "You have observed well, Hastings, but you must see deeper. The killer plays a game of trust. They sow discord, plant doubts, and watch as others destroy themselves. But who, Poirot?" Hastings asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "Allerton Norton. Someone else entirely." Poirot's smile was faint, almost sad. "That is for you to deduce, mon ami. I give you the pieces, but you must fit them together. Trust your instincts, but question them too. The killer prize clever, and they will use your trust against you." Hastings left the room, his mind reeling. The house seemed to close in around him, its creaking floors and shadowed corners whispering of secrets. As he passed Judith's room, he paused, tempted to knock to bridge the gap between them. But the memory of her sharp words stopped him, and he continued to his own room, the weight of Poirot's challenge pressing heavier than ever in the days that followed. The atmosphere at Styles grew thicker with suspicion. Hastings watched the guests closely, noting every glance, every word that seemed out of place. Allerton's charm took on a sinister edge, his flirtations with Judith more overt. Norton's quiet demeanor seemed less shy and more secretive, his journal always close at hand. Even Mrs. Luttrell, with her bustling cheer, began to seem like a facade, her smiles too bright, her questions too probing. One afternoon, Hastings found himself alone in the library, a dusty room filled with books that hadn't been touched in years. He was searching for a distraction when he noticed a small, leather-bound volume tucked behind a row of novels. Curious, he pulled it out and found it was a diary, its pages yellowed but filled with neat, precise handwriting. The entries were dated years ago, written by a guest at Styles during its days as a grand estate. The writer described a visitor, a charismatic figure who had a knack for turning friends against each other, leaving chaos in their wake. The final entry was chilling. "I fear I've said too much. If anything happens to me, it was no accident." Hastings' heart raced as he read the words. Was this a clue to the killer's past? Or was it just another shadow, another piece of the puzzle designed to mislead? He slipped the diary into his pocket, determined to show it to Poirot. But as he left the library, he nearly collided with Miss Cole, her eyes wide with surprise. "Captain Hastings, you startled me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What were you doing in there?" "Just browsing," he replied, his hand tightening around the diary. Her gaze flickered to his pocket, and for a moment he thought he saw a flash of something guilt in her eyes. But she smiled and excused herself, leaving him alone in the hallway. That evening, over dinner, the tension reached a new peak. Colonel Luttrell, still smarting from the card game, made a barbed comment about Allerton's city manners, prompting a sharp retort that silenced the table. Judith, seated next to Allerton, laughed at his quip, but her eyes were cold, calculating. Hastings watched her, his heart sinking. Was she playing a game of her own, or was she being played? After dinner, Hastings found Poirot in the garden, bundled in a coat despite the mild evening. The detective's face was pale, but his eyes burned with determination. "You have something to tell me, he said, before Hastings could speak. Hastings handed over the diary, explaining where he'd found it. Poirot flipped through the pages, his expression growing graver with each entry. "This is significant, Hastings," he said at last. "It confirms what I have suspected. The killer has been here before, in one form or another. They leave no trace, only whispers of their influence. But who, Poirot?" Hastings pressed, his voice low. "How do we stop them?" Poirot's gaze was steady, unyielding. "By playing their game, mon ami, but with one difference. We play to win. Tomorrow you will do exactly as I say. Spread a rumor, a small seed of doubt. Watch how they react, and we will see who flinches." Hastings nodded, though his stomach twisted at the thought. The game of trust was becoming a maze, and he was no longer sure who he could trust, not the guests, not even himself. As he returned to the house, the shadows seemed to deepen, and the walls of Styles whispered of secrets yet to be uncovered. The chapter drew to a close, with Hastings standing at his window, staring out at the moonlit garden. Poirot's words echoed in his mind. The killer is closer than we think. He thought of Judith, of her sharp words and secretive glances, and a cold fear gripped him. Was she a victim, a pawn, or something else entirely? The answer lay just out of reach, a shadow moving in the dark. And Hastings knew that the next move in this deadly game would change everything. Chapter 7. Shadows in the night. The air at Styles Court was thick with unease, as though the house itself held its breath. The night was unseasonably cold for late summer, the kind of chill that crept through the cracks of the old manor and settled. into one's bones. Captain Arthur Hastings lay awake in his room, the creaking of the ancient floorboards and the distant howl of wind outside keeping sleep at bay. His mind churned with Poirot's cryptic warnings, the faces of the guests blurring, kit into a gallery of suspects. The scream that shattered the silence at midnight was so piercing, so raw that it sent him bolting upright, his heart hammering. He fumbled for his dressing gown, the cold floor biting at his bare feet as he stumbled to the door. The scream had come from the east wing, where the guest rooms were clustered. As he stepped into the dimly lit corridor, he saw other doors creaking open, faces pale and eyes wide. Judith, his daughter, emerged from her room, her dark hair disheveled, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. "Father, what was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling but her gaze sharp. "I don't know," Hastings replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "Stay close." He moved toward the source of the sound, joined by Colonel Luttrell, who appeared in his pajamas, his military bearing undiminished despite the hour. "Sounded like a woman," he muttered, gripping a poker he'd snatched from his fireplace. "Came from Miss Cole's room. I'd wager." The three of them hurried down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Other guests were stirring now. Boyd Carrington, his silver hair glinting in the flickering light of a wall sconce, and Nurse Craven, her expression unreadable as she tied her robe. Allerton, predictably, was nowhere to be seen, likely sleeping through the chaos or avoiding it altogether. Norton, the quiet ornithologist, hovered at the edge of the group, his glasses reflecting the dim light like twin moons. Miss Cole's door was ajar, a sliver of lamplight spilling into the hall. Hastings pushed it open, his breath catching as he took in the scene. The room was in disarray, the usual clutter of a lived-in space, but a violent upheaval. A heavy oak bookshelf had toppled forward, its contents strewn across the floor. Papers and books scattered like fallen leaves. Miss Cole stood in the center of the room, her face ashen, her hands trembling as she clutched a candlestick like a weapon. Her nightgown was torn at the shoulder, and a thin trickle of blood ran from a scratch on her cheek. "Good heavens, are you all right?" Hastings exclaimed, rushing to her side. Miss Cole's eyes darted to him, wild and unfocused. "It fell," she stammered. "I was reading, and I heard a noise, something creaking, and then it just came down. I barely got out of the way." Judith stepped forward, her practical nature taking over. "You're hurt. Let me see." She gently took the candlestick from Miss Cole's shaking hands and examined the scratch. "It's shallow, but we should clean it. Nurse Craven, could you?" Nurse Craven nodded, her movements brisk as she approached. "I'll fetch my kit," she said, her tone clipped, betraying no hint of the fear that gripped the others. Colonel Luttrell surveyed the room, his eyes narrowing as he studied the fallen bookshelf. "This thing's solid oak. Doesn't just tip over on its own." He knelt, inspecting the base where the shelf had stood. "Look here," he said, pointing to a series of deep scratches in the floorboards. Something was wedged here, like a lever. This was no accident. Hastings felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Poirot's words echoed. In his mind, a shadow that kills. He glanced at Judith, who was helping Miss Cole to a chair, then at the others gathered in the doorway. Boyd Carrington's face was grim, Norton's nervous fidgeting more pronounced than usual. The absence of Allerton and the Franklins was conspicuous, though Hastings recalled that Mrs. Franklin had been unwell earlier that day, and her husband was likely attending to her. "We need Poirot," Hastings said, his voice firm despite the knot in his stomach. "Someone fetch him." "I'll go," Boyd Carrington offered, disappearing down the corridor with surprising agility for a man of his age. As they waited, Hastings studied the room more closely. The bookshelf had been positioned against the wall opposite Miss Cole's bed, its contents a mix of novels, journals, and a few old photographs now scattered across the floor. One photograph caught his eye, faded image of a young woman with striking features standing beside a man in military uniform. Put it up, noting the inscription on the back, "To Elizabeth, with love, 1918, before he could ponder its significance. Judith's voice broke his thoughts. "Father, look at this." She held up a small, intricately carved wooden box that had been hidden among the spilled books. It was locked, but the lid bore a faint symbol, a serpent coiled around a staff. This was under the shelf. "It doesn't look like something Miss Cole would own." Miss Cole, now seated and sipping water Nurse Craven had brought, shook her head. "It's not mine. I've never seen it before." Hastings frowned, turning the box over in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, and a faint rattling suggested something inside. He was about to speak when Poirot's voice, weak but commanding, filled the room. "Mon ami, what is this chaos?" Poirot stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes sharp despite the pallor of his face. Boyd Carrington stood behind him, looking concerned. Hastings quickly recounted the events, showing Poirot the box and the photograph. Poirot's gaze lingered on the box, his lips pursing. "This is most interesting," he murmured. "And the bookshelf, Colonel Luttrell. You say it was tampered with?" "Without a doubt," Luttrell replied. "Someone meant to do harm." Poirot's eyes swept the room, taking in every detail: the scattered books, the scratched floor, the trembling Miss Cole. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, addressing her, "can you describe the noise you heard before the shelf fell?" Miss Cole hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her nightgown. "It was a scraping sound, like wood against wood. I thought it was the wind at first, but then it grew louder, and the shelf started to tilt. I jumped out of the way just in time." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And you saw no one?" "No one," she whispered, "but I felt watched." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Hastings felt a prickle at the back of his neck, his mind racing to the killer Poirot had described, a manipulator, who struck without leaving a trace. He glanced at Norton, who was hovering near the door, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes darting nervously. Then at Nurse Craven, who was cleaning Miss Cole's scratch with a practiced efficiency that seemed almost to calm. "Poirot," Hastings said, lowering his voice, This can't be a coincidence. First Mrs. Franklin's illness, now this. The killer is getting bolder. Poirot's eyes met his, and for a moment Hastings saw a flicker of something fear, perhaps, or resolve. Oui, mon ami, Poirot said softly. The killer grows impatient, but so do I. He turned to the group, his voice rising slightly. Mesdames et messieurs, return to your rooms. Lock your doors. We will discuss this further in the morning. The guests dispersed reluctantly, murmuring among themselves. Judith lingered, her eyes searching Hastings's face. Father, you don't think, could it be one of us? Hastings wanted to reassure her, to say it was impossible, but Poirot's warnings held him back. Stay in your room tonight, he said instead, and don't open the door for anyone. She nodded, her expression troubled, and left with, Nurse Craven. Poirot gestured for Hastings to stay. Once they were alone, the detective's demeanor changed, his frailty giving way to a fierce intensity. Hastings, you must listen carefully, Poirot said, his voice low. This incident with Mademoiselle Cole is no accident, but it is not the killer's true aim. It is a distraction, a test of our vigilance. The real strike will come soon, and we must be ready. But why not tell me who you suspect, Hastings? Demanded, his frustration boiling over. You keep saying the killer is close, but you won't give me a name. How am I supposed to help if you keep me in the dark? Poirot's face softened, but his eyes remained steely. Because, mon ami, to name the killer now would put you in greater danger. You are my eyes and ears, but you must trust me to guide you. The killer watches us, even now. Hastings clenched his fists, torn between loyalty and exasperation. You're asking me to walk blindfolded into a lion's den. Nan, Poirot said, a faint smile touching his lips. I am asking you to walk with your eyes open, but to let me choose the path. Before Hastings could argue further, a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. He spun toward the window, where the heavy drapes swayed slightly, as though disturbed by a draught. But the window was closed, the latch secure. His pulse quickened as he crossed the room, pulling back the drapes to reveal nothing but the dark, empty night beyond. Poirot, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone was here. Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his fingers tightening around his cane. The silence that followed was heavier than the scream that had woken them, filled with a weight of unseen eyes and unspoken truths. The next morning, Styles Court buzzed with nervous energy. Breakfast was a tense affair, the guests exchanging wary glances over their toast and tea. Mrs. Franklin, pale but recovered, sat beside her husband, who seemed more absorbed in a scientific journal than in the events of the night. Allerton, who had miraculously appeared after missing the chaos, lounged with his usual nonchalance, though Hastings noticed his eyes flicker toward Judith more than once. Poirot, seated at the head of the table, looked frailer than ever, but his presence commanded attention. Mies, Amos, he began, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Last night's incident was no mere accident. Someone in this house sought to harm Mademoiselle Cole. I urge you all to be vigilant. Lock your doors, trust no one, and report anything unusual to me or Captain Hastings." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a fog. Norton dropped his spoon, the clatter jarring in the stillness. "Surely you don't think one of us," he began. But Poirot raised a hand. "I think only what the evidence tells me," he said smoothly. "And the evidence, it speaks loudly." After breakfast, Hastings followed Poirot to the library, where the detective had requested privacy. The room was a haven of faded grandeur, its shelves lined with dusty tomes and its windows overlooking the overgrown gardens. Poirot settled into a high-backed chair, his hands folded over his cane. "Hastings," he said, "you saw something last night, did you not?" At the window, Hastings nodded, recounting the movement of the drapes. "It could have been the wind, but I don't think so." The window was locked. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. The killer is clever, but not invisible. They leave traces, however faint. The box you found in Mademoiselle Cole's room, did you notice its craftsmanship? It is not English. The serpent and staff. A symbol of medicine, perhaps, or something more sinister." Medicine. Hastings frowned, his mind racing to Dr. Franklin and Nurse Craven. "You think it's connected to one of them?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, his tone maddeningly vague. "Or perhaps it is a misdirection. The killer delights in such games. Tell me, what do you know of Mademoiselle Cole's past?" Hastings hesitated. "Not much. She's quiet, keeps to herself. She mentioned once that she traveled extensively before the war, but she didn't elaborate." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And yet, that photograph you found, it suggests a connection to someone, perhaps someone significant. We must learn more, but discreetly, Hastings. The killer is watching, and we must not tip our hand." The day passed in a blur of suspicion and subtle interrogations. Hastings spoke with each guest, probing for inconsistencies. Colonel Luttrell recounted his military days, hinting at a falling out with a former comrade that left him bitter. Boyd Carrington spoke fondly of his late wife, but his eyes lingered on Judith when he thought no one was watching. Nurse Craven, deficient and guarded, deflected questions about her past with practiced ease. Norton, meanwhile, seemed increasingly agitated, his bird-watching binoculars rarely leaving his hands. Judith, to Hastings's dismay, spent much of the day with Allerton, their laughter drifting through the gardens. He wanted to confront her, to warn her about Allerton's charm, but Poirot's words held him back. "Watch, mon ami, but do not act." He felt like a pawn in Poirot's game, and the thought chafed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hastings found himself drawn back to Miss Cole's room. The bookshelf had been righted, but the scratches on the floor remained, a silent accusation. He knelt, examining them closely, when a soft creak made him freeze. The sound came from the hallway, deliberate and slow, like a predator stalking its prey. He rose, his hand slipping to the pocket where he kept his service revolver, a habit from his army days. The corridor was empty, but a faint scent lingered, sharp and chemical, like antiseptic. It reminded him of Nurse Craven's medical kit, but also of something else, something he couldn't place, as he returned to his room. A folded note lay on his pillow, the handwriting elegant but unfamiliar. It read, "Trust no one, Captain, not even those closest to you." His blood ran cold. The note could only have been placed there in the last hour, while he was in Miss Cole's room. Someone had been in his room, unseen, unheard. He showed the note to Poirot, who read it with a grim smile. "The killer grows bold indeed," he said. "But this is good, Hastings. They are nervous. They make mistakes. What do we do now?" Hastings asked, his voice tight. "We wait," Poirot replied. "And we watch. The shadow is close, mon ami, but it cannot hide forever." The night stretched on each creak and whisper, amplifying Hastings's unease. He lay awake, the note burning in his mind, the faces of the guests swirling like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. Somewhere in Styles Court, a killer moved among them, their motives cloaked in darkness. And as the clock struck midnight, Hastings knew that the next scream might not end in survival. Chapter 8. The Mask of Innocence. The air at Styles Court hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, as if the estate itself were holding its breath. The late summer sun slanted through the tall windows of the drawing-room, casting long wavering shadows across the worn Persian rug. Hercule Poirot, seated in his high-backed wheelchair, commanded the room with an air of quiet authority. His eyes, sharp as ever despite the frailty of his body, darted from one guest to another, reading their faces as if they were pages in a well-worn book. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing near the fireplace, felt the weight of his friend's scrutiny, though he wasn't sure if it was directed at him or the eclectic assembly gathered before them. The guests, an uneasy mix of strangers and acquaintances, sat in a loose semicircle, their postures betraying varying degrees of discomfort. Colonel Luttrell, his face flushed from too much sherry, fidgeted with his cufflinks. His wife, Daisy, perched primly on the edge of her chair, her lips pursed as if guarding a secret. Judith Hastings, Arthur's daughter, leaned forward, her dark eyes bright with curiosity, though a faint crease of worry marred her brow. Beside her, Major Allerton lounged with an easy charm, his smile just a shade too polished. Dr. Franklin, pale and distracted, scribbled notes in a small leather-bound journal, while his wife, Barbara, reclined on a chaise longue, her delicate frame swathed in a shawl despite the warmth of the room. Nurse Craven, her starched uniform crisp, stood near the door, her gaze flickering between Barbara and the others. Miss Cole, a quiet spinster with a penchant for knitting, sat with her needles clicking softly, her face unreadable. Boyd Carrington, the affable baronet, leaned against the mantelpiece, his jovial demeanor at odds with the tension in the air. And then there was Norton, the ornithologist, his small, nervous frame hunched over a tattered copy of Crime and Punishment, his eyes darting to the others when he thought no one was watching. Poirot cleared his throat, a small sound that silenced "Broom" "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice soft yet commanding, "I have asked you here this evening for a purpose. It is not, I assure you, for mere pleasantries. No, no. We are here to discuss something far more grave." Hastings shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around the stem of his untouched wine-glass. Poirot's theatrics were familiar, but there was an edge to his tone tonight, a gravity that made Hastings' stomach twist. He glanced at Judith, hoping to catch her eye, but she was staring at Poirot, her expression unreadable. "There is among us," Poirot continued, his gaze sweeping the room, "a person of extraordinary cunning, a mind that weaves webs so delicate, so invisible, that even the most discerning among us might not see them until it is too late. This person does not kill with their own hands. Oh no, they plant the seed, nurture the thought, and let others do the deed." A murmur rippled through the room. Colonel Luttrell snorted, his moustache quivering. "Sounds like a lot of nonsense, Poirot. What's this about? Some parlor game?" Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes remained cold. "Not bay game, Colonel. A matter of life and death. 5 deaths, to be precise, each one orchestrated by a shadow who walks among us." Hastings' heart thudded. He'd heard Poirot's theory before, in the quiet of their private conversations, but to hear it laid bare before the entire household was something else entirely. He scanned the faces around him, searching for a flicker of guilt, a telltale sign. Norton's fingers tightened on his book, the pages crinkling softly. Barbara Franklin's hand fluttered to her throat, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or perhaps something else. Allerton's smile didn't waver, but his knuckles whitened around his glass. 5 murders. Boyd Carrington's voice was hearty, almost jovial, as if trying to dispel the gloom. "Come now, Poirot. You can't mean to say one of us is some sort of master criminal. We're just a bunch of ordinary folk, aren't we? Ordinary." Poirot's voice was sharp, like the crack of a whip. "There is nothing ordinary about murder, Sir William, nor about the mind that conceives it. This person, they are a chameleon, blending into the tapestry of everyday life. They smile, they converse, they offer sympathy, but behind the mask of innocence lies a will of iron." The room fell silent, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock, put in the corner. Hastings felt a chill, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. He glanced at Judith again, but she was watching Allerton now, her lips parted slightly, as if caught in a spell. Hastings' jaw tightened. He didn't trust Allerton, with his easy charm and too perfect manners. There was something about the man that set his teeth on edge, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Poirot leaned forward, his hands clasped over the blanket draped across his knees. "Tonight I propose a little exercise. I will share with you a piece of information, a clue, if you will, and I ask you to consider it carefully. Somewhere in this house, hidden among the possessions of one among us, is a message, a code, perhaps, or a note thought that speaks to the heart of this matter. It is a small thing, but it is the key to unmasking our shadow." A gasp escaped Barbara Franklin, quickly stifled. Nurse Craven moved to her side, her expression one of professional concern, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. "Are you feeling unwell, Mrs. Franklin?" she asked, her voice smooth as silk. Barbara shook her head, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. No, I'm quite all right. Just surprised, that's all." Hastings watched her closely. Barbara's frailty seemed almost too perfect, too calculated. He remembered Poirot's words from earlier that day. "The mask of innocence, mon ami, is often the most convincing." Was Barbara playing a part, or was she genuinely fragile? He couldn't tell, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. Miss Cole's knitting needles paused, her eyes flicking up to meet Poirot's coded message. She asked, her voice quiet but steady, "That sounds rather fanciful, Mr. Poirot. Are you sure you're not letting your imagination run away with you?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "The imagination, Mademoiselle Cole, is a powerful tool. But I assure you, my suspicions are grounded in fact. The message exists, and it will lead us to the truth." The room buzzed with uneasy whispers. Colonel Luttrell muttered something about damned theatrics, while Daisy shushed him sharply. Boyd Carrington chuckled, but the sound was strained. Norton, still clutching his book, seemed to shrink into his chair, his eyes darting toward the door, as if longing to escape. Judith spoke up, her voice clear and defiant. "If there's a message, why not search for it now? Why all this secrecy, Mr. Poirot? If you know something, tell us plainly." Hastings' heart sank. Judith's boldness, while admirable, was reckless. He wanted to pull her aside, to warn her to be careful. But she was no longer the little girl who listened to her father's advice. She was a woman now, fiercely independent, and her attraction to Allerton was making her blind to the danger Poirot kept hinting at. Poirot's gaze softened as he looked at Judith, but there was a warning in his eyes. "Patience, mademoiselle. Hastings, the truth reveals itself in its own time. To act too hastily is to risk alerting our quarry." Allerton leaned forward, his voice smooth as honey. "Come now, Poirot. You're making us all jump at shadows. If there's a killer among us, why not name them? Or are you just enjoying the drama?" The words were light, teasing, but there was an edge to them, a challenge. Hastings felt a surge, of irritation. Allerton's charm was wearing thin, and the way he looked at Judith like a cat eyeing a canary made Hastings' blood boil. Poirot's response was calm, almost serene. "The drama, Major Allerton, is not of my making. It is the killer who sets the stage, who writes the script. I merely interpret." The conversation shifted after that, the guests dispersing into smaller groups, their voices low and tense. Hastings lingered near Poirot, his mind racing. The idea of a coded message was intriguing, but also frustratingly vague. Poirot's methods, as always, were maddeningly indirect, but Hastings had learned long ago to trust his friend's instincts. If Poirot believed there was a message, then it existed. The question was, who was hiding it, and why? As the evening wore on, Hastings found himself drawn into a conversation with Dr. Franklin, who had finally set aside his notebook. The scientist's eyes were bright with a fervor that unsettled Hastings. "You know," Franklin said, his voice low, "there's something fascinating about Poirot's theory. The idea of a mind manipulating others to kill. It's almost like a scientific experiment. Control the variables, predict the outcome." Hastings frowned. "You sound almost admiring, Franklin." The doctor blinked, as if startled by his own words. "Oh, no, not admiring, just intrigued. The human mind is a complex machine, Captain. To understand it, to predict its behavior, that's the key to progress." Judith joined them, her expression thoughtful. "But isn't that dangerous, Dr. Franklin? Playing with people's minds, manipulating their choices. It's not science's control." Franklin's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile. "Perhaps. But isn't all science about control? Controlling disease, controlling nature, controlling ourselves." The conversation left Hastings be uneasy. There was something in Franklin's tone, a detachment that bordered on coldness. He glanced at Barbara, who was now sipping tea under Nurse Craven's watchful eye. Was Franklin's neglect of his wife deliberate, or was he simply too absorbed in his work to notice her fragility? And what did Judith see in Allerton that made her defend him so fiercely? As the guests began to retire for the night, Hastings caught Poirot's eye. The detective beckoned him closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mon ami, you must be vigilant. The killer is watching, waiting for a misstep. The message I spoke of it is real, and it is close. Keep your eyes open and your heart guarded." Hastings nodded, though his mind was a whirlwind of doubt. But who, Poirot? Who is it? Norton? Allerton? Someone else? Poirot's smile was sad, almost pitying. "The answer lies in what you see, Hastings, not in what I tell you. Observe, and the truth will reveal itself." The night was far from over, and as Hastings made his way to his room, the weight of Poirot's words pressed heavily on him. The house seemed to pulse with secrets, each creak of the floorboards a whisper of danger. He passed Norton's room, and heard the soft rustle of pages, as if the man were still reading his book. Down the hall, a door clicked. Shuttleton's, perhaps, or Miss Cole's. The shadows seemed to move, to shift, as if a live dot in his room. Hastings sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens. The coded message Poirot had mentioned gnawed at him. Was it a letter, a diary entry, a scrap of paper hidden in a book? And why had Poirot chosen to reveal its existence to everyone? Was he baiting the killer, or simply testing the waters? A soft knock at the door startled him. It was Judith, her face pale but determined. "Father, we need to talk." Hastings gestured for her to sit, his heart heavy. "Judith, you must be careful. This business with Allerton." She cut him off, her voice sharp. "I'm not a child. "Father, I know what I'm doing, but that's not why I'm here. I overheard something tonight, something strange." Hastings leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What did you hear?" Judith hesitated, her eyes searching his. It was Norton and Miss Cole, in the library after Poirot's speech. They were whispering about a letter, something about keeping it safe and not letting him find it. I couldn't hear everything, but it sounded secretive. Hastings' mind raced. A letter. Could it be the coded message Poirot had mentioned? And why were Norton and Miss Cole two of the least likely suspects involved? Norton, with his nervous tics and obsession with crime stories, seemed too timid to be a mastermind. And Miss Cole, with her quiet demeanor and endless knitting, hardly seemed the type to orchestrate murders. Yet Poirot had taught him long ago that appearances could be deceiving. "Did you tell Poirot?" he asked. Judith shook her head. "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. I don't know who to trust anymore." The vulnerability in her voice pierced Hastings' heart. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her jaw set. "I'll be careful, Father. But you need to be, too. There's something wrong here. Something dark. I can feel it." After she left, Hastings sat in silence, his thoughts a tangled mess. The coded message, the whispered conversation, Poirot's cryptic warnings, it all pointed to a truth just out of reach. He resolved to search for the letter himself, to uncover whatever Norton and Miss Cole were hiding. But as he lay in bed, the darkness pressing against the windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was one step ahead, watching, waiting, and weaving their deadly web. The night stretched on, filled with the soft sounds of a house that never truly slept. Somewhere, hidden among the ordinary possessions of an ordinary guest, a message waited a key to unmasking a killer who thrived in the shadows. And as Hastings drifted into an uneasy sleep, he couldn't help but wonder if the truth, when it came, would destroy everything he held dear. Chapter 9. A dangerous game. The air at Styles Court was heavy with the scent of impending rain. The sky a bruised expanse of grey that seemed to press down on the house like a lid on a simmering pot. Captain Arthur Hastings stood at the window of the drawing-room, his reflection ghostly against the darkening glass, watching as the first fat drops began to splatter against the panes. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The guests, trapped by the brewing storm, moved about with a restless energy, their voices sharp with unspoken accusations, their glances darting like knives. Hercule Poirot, frail but unyielding, sat in his high-backed chair by the fire, his eyes half closed but missing nothing. Hastings knew that Poirot was weaving a web, and someone in this room was about to be caught. The day had begun with a deceptive calm, the kind that precedes catastrophe. Hastings had followed Poirot's cryptic instructions from the previous night, trailing Major Allerton through the winding paths of the estate's overgrown gardens. Allerton, with his easy charm and polished smile, had been deep in conversation with Judith, Hastings' daughter, her laughter ringing out like a bell in the morning mist. Hastings had lingered behind a gnarled yew tree, his heart twisting as he overheard Allerton's words, smooth, honeyed, and laced with something darker, something that made Judith lean closer, her eyes bright with a dangerous trust. "You're not like the others here," Judith Allerton had said, his voice low and intimate. "You see the world as it could be, not as it is. That's rare. Dangerous, even." Judith had smiled, her cheeks flushed, and Hastings had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. Poirot's warning about the killer's methods, emotions, sowing chaos a code in his mind. Was Allerton the shadow Poirot hunted, or was Judith herself being drawn into a game she couldn't win? As the storm gathered strength outside, Hastings watched Allerton across the drawing-room, lounging against the mantelpiece. His posture relaxed, but his eyes alert, scanning the room like a predator sizing up its prey. Judith sat near the piano, her fingers idly tracing the keys, her expression distant. Hastings wanted to cross the room, to pull her aside and warn her. But Poirot's voice, sharp and low, had stayed him earlier. "Observe, mon ami, but do not interfere. The trap must be set with care." The trap. Poirot's words had been maddeningly vague, as always, but Hastings had learned to trust the little Belgian's instincts. Still, the weight of inaction gnawed at him. The events of the past days, the vial of poison in the greenhouse, Mrs. Franklin's sudden illness, the coded message Poirot had found, had left him jumpy, suspicious of every glance and gesture. The house itself seemed complicit, its creaking floors and shadowed corners whispering of secrets. A sudden crack of thunder made Miss Cole, the quiet spinster with a penchant for cryptic remarks, flinch in her chair. She clutched her embroidery, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "This storm," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "It's as if the heavens themselves are angry." "Nonsense," Colonel Luttrell snapped, pacing near the bookshelves. His face was flushed, his military bearing fraying under the strain of confinement. "It's just weather. No need to make a drama of it." But his eyes darted to his wife, who sat knitting in a corner, her needles clicking with a rhythm that seemed almost defiant. Mrs. Luttrell had been unusually quiet all day, her usual sharp-tongued commentary replaced by a brooding silence that unnerved Hastings more than her barbs ever had. Poirot stirred, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. "The weather, Colonel, is but a mirror of the human heart," he said, his voice soft but carrying. "When the storm rages within, it finds its echo without. Would you not agree, Major Allerton?" Allerton's smile didn't falter, but Hastings caught the brief tightening of his jaw. "I'm no philosopher, Poirot," he said lightly, sipping his whiskey. "I leave the storms to the poets and the heart to the romantics." Judith's fingers stilled on the piano keys, and she looked up, her gaze locking with Allerton's for a moment too long. Hastings' stomach twisted. He wanted to shout to warn her, but Poirot's hand, frail but firm, closed briefly on his wrist, a silent command to hold his peace. The door to the drawing-room burst open. admitting Nurse Craven, her hair slightly damp from a brief foray outside. She carried a tray of tea things, her movements brisk but her expression guarded. "Storm's getting worse," she said, setting the tray on the table. "No one's going anywhere tonight." "Good," Poirot said, almost to himself. "Then we are all where we should be." Hastings frowned, catching the glint in Poirot's eye. The little detective was up to something, but what? The room felt like a chessboard, each guest a piece in a game only Poirot understood. Norton, the ornithologist, sat in a corner, his nose buried in a tattered book about rare birds, but his fingers twitched nervously, betraying his calm facade. Boyd Carrington, the affable baronet, was regaling Dr. Franklin with tales of his travels in India, but his laughter sounded forced, his eyes straying to the door as if expecting an interruption. Barbara Franklin, pale and fragile, reclined on a chaise longue, her hands folded over a shawl. Her gaze distant but sharp till tea was poured. The clink of china, a brittle counterpoint to the storm's roar. Hastings accepted a cup from Nurse Craven, his mind racing. Poirot had warned that the killer thrived on chaos, orchestrating betrayals and planting seeds of doubt. Was the poison in the greenhouse a misstep, or a deliberate lure? Was Mrs. Franklin's illness a warning, or a rehearsal for something worse? And Judith, his bright, headstrong Judith, was she a pawn, or something more? A sharp cry broke his reverie. Mrs. Luttrell stood, her knitting tumbling to the floor, her face pale. "My door," she said, her voice trembling. "The lock been tampered with. I checked it this afternoon, and it's been forced." The room fell silent. The only sound, the relentless drumming of rain against the windows. Colonel Luttrell strode to her side, his face thunderous. "What do you mean? Forced? Are you sure?" "I know what I saw," she snapped, her composure. "Praying. The key wouldn't turn properly. Someone's been in our room." Poirot's eyes gleamed, but his voice was calm. "Madame, when did you last check the lock?" "This morning," she said, her hands twisting together. "It was. Fine, then. I only noticed after lunch, when I went to fetch my shawl." "Interesting," Poirot murmured, his fingers steepled. "And you are certain it was not simply a fault in the mechanism?" "I am not a fool, Monsieur Poirot," Mrs. Luttrell said sharply. "The scratches were fresh. Someone forced it." A murmur rippled through the room. Miss Cole's needle resumed its rhythm, but her hands shook slightly. Norton closed his book with a soft thud, his eyes darting to Allerton, who raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Judith stood, her expression defiant. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Why would anyone tamper with a lock? It's probably just the house settling. It's old, isn't it?" "Old houses do not scratch their own locks," Mademoiselle Poirot said gently, but there was steel in his tone. "This is a house of secrets, and secrets have a way of breaking free." Hastings felt a prickle of unease. The tampered lock was no accident. He was sure of it. Poirot had been right. The killer was growing bolder, their moves more reckless. But why a lock? To plant something, or to take it? He glanced at Poirot, hoping for a clue, But the detective's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the group, as if weighing each reaction. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Boyd Carrington said, his voice hearty but strained. "Put could be a servant or a mistake. No need to assume the worst. Assumptions are dangerous," Sir William Poirot said. "But so is ignorance. We must investigate. Captain Hastings, perhaps you would be so kind as to examine the lock." "With Madame Luttrell's?" Hastings nodded, grateful for something to do. He followed Mrs. Luttrell upstairs, her steps quick and agitated. The corridor was dim, the storm's gloom seeping through the windows. Her room was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. The lock was indeed scratched, the metal around the keyhole scored with fresh, jagged marks. Hastings knelt, his fingers tracing the damage. "This wasn't an accident," he said, his voice low. "Someone used a tool, maybe, a screwdriver." Mrs. Luttrell's lips tightened. "I knew it. But why? We've nothing worth stealing." "Perhaps it's not about stealing," Hastings said, his mind racing. "Perhaps it's about leaving something behind, or sending a message." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked less like the sharp-tongued matron and more like a frightened woman. "A message? From whom?" "I don't know," Hastings admitted, but his thoughts were with Poirot's words. "The killer is closer than we think." He straightened, his gaze sweeping the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The bed neatly made, a small desk cluttered with letters, a wardrobe half open. But the air felt charged, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Back downstairs, the mood had shifted. The guests were restless, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of speculation. Judith was arguing with Allerton, her tone sharp, while Norton hovered near the door, his book forgotten. Nurse Craven was pouring more tea, her movements deliberate, but Hastings caught her stealing a glance at Dr. Franklin, who sat silently, his eyes fixed on his wife. Poirot raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "Mies Amos," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The storm has trapped us, but it has also given us a gift, time. Time to observe, to question, to uncover. Someone in this house plays a dangerous game, and the tampered lock is but a move on. They're bored. We must be vigilant, vigilant." Colonel Luttrell scoffed. "You're saying one of us did this? That's absurd." "Is it?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "In my experience, Colonel, the absurd is often the truth in disguise. Tell me, have any of you noticed anything unusual today? A glance, a word, a gesture?" The room was silent, but Hastings saw the flickers of Uni's Miss Cole's needle pausing, Norton's fingers tightening on his book, Allerton's smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Judith crossed her arms, her expression defiant. "This is a waste of time," she said. "You're seeing shadows where there are none, Monsieur Poirot. Shadows, mademoiselle, cast light on the truth," Poirot said. "And I assure you, there is a shadow in this house, one that kills." The words hung in the air, heavy as the storm outside. Hastings felt a chill, not from the wind, but from the certainty in Poirot's voice. The killer was here, among them. And the tampered lock was a warning or a prelude. He glanced at Judith, her face pale but resolute, and his heart ached. He had to protect her, but from whom? Allerton, with his honeyed words, Norton, with his nervous tics, or someone else? Be entirely hiding behind a mask of innocence. As the storm raged on, the drawing-room became a crucible, each guest a suspect, each word a potential clue. Hastings resolved to watch, to listen, to follow Poirot's lead. The game was dangerous, but he would play it for Judith, for Poirot, and for the truth that lay buried in the shadows of Styles Court. The night stretched on, the storm a relentless symphony of wind and rain, and Hastings knew that the next move would come soon, perhaps too soon.